The wind carried the smell of blood across King's Landing on the day Lord Eddard Stark was executed. The sun was high in a sky too bright and blue for such a dreadful deed. The crowd was a roaring sea of faces, all eyes fixed upon the makeshift dais where Lord Stark knelt, the sword of the king's justice glinting above him. Among the onlookers, some jeered, some gasped. Others wore looks of horror, hands pressed to mouths. In that moment, everything shifted in the Seven Kingdoms, though few could have said precisely how. The North had lost its warden, and the realm had lost a man of honor that day. Had anyone suspected the far-reaching consequences of this one execution, this single dreadful swing of the sword, perhaps they would have tried to stop it. But the sword fell. The news traveled quickly. Ravens soared northward, crossing the green fields and rolling hills, beating wings over the Trident, until they reached Moat Cailin and the castles beyond, announcing Eddard Stark's death to the north. In Winterfell, the hearts of the people turned to ice. Inside the ancient keep, young Bran Stark, newly crippled, stared at the letter with a numbness in his veins. Beside him, Rickon wailed. It was Maester Luwin who read the dire message. The hearts of the servants sank. They whispered in corners, called upon old gods in silent prayer. But the news was borne with the hardest shock by Robb Stark, newly proclaimed king in the north by his lords, though the actual title, in that very moment, still felt ill-fitting upon his shoulders. Robb learned of his father's death in the camp near the Twins, where he had only just bargained safe passage for his armies. One day, he had gone to bed the heir of Winterfell and a rebellious son raising his banners in a war to free his father. The next morning, he woke as a newly orphaned young man, with the full might of the north behind him, screaming for vengeance. Grey Wind, his direwolf, had howled the night before, restless and furious in his large kennel. Many took that as an omen. Robb was alone in his tent when the letter came through. He read it once, then read it twice, hardly believing his eyes. Then he tore it into pieces and roared with fury, scaring even the seasoned guards outside. The fury spread among his bannermen in a wave. Great Jon Umber and other lords hammered fists upon shields, calling for retribution. For Ned, they cried. For Eddard Stark. The roars broke through the camp with the resonance of rolling thunder. And so was the spirit in which they crowned Robb. My king, they said, the king in the north. And that very night, a large gathering of lords pledged swords and life to see House Stark avenged, to see the north separated from the Iron Throne if necessary, and to bleed those who had butchered their lord. Yet, in that swirl of grief and anger, Robb Stark stood in front of a large table strewn with battle maps. His blue eyes, shot through with red from sleepless nights, flickered with a deeper worry than even the war to come. He was thinking of his brother, his half-brother, who at that very moment was wearing black upon the wall. Jon Snow. The knowledge that the two of them were separated by an oath made Robb's heart twist. Hadn't they grown up together, learned swordplay side by side, wrestled in the Winterfell courtyard? And yet, he could not even confide in Jon as a full brother, or so the old custom said. Jon's oath to the Night's Watch severed ties of inheritance, of family. Only blood remained, intangible but undeniable. That oath bound Jon to neutrality, to a lifelong service. And still, in his heart, Robb did not truly believe Jon could stand idle after hearing how their father died. While his men sharpened swords and polished armor, making ready for the war to come, Robb found himself ruminating on whether he should attempt to reach Jon, in secret or otherwise. By the laws of the land, a man of the Night's Watch must not get entangled in the wars of the realm. Yet the circumstances were extraordinary. The crown had just butchered his father. When the Stark line was threatened, when the honor of their name was at stake, could Jon truly remain an observer? The vow was ironclad, but so had been Ned Stark's sense of duty to protect his children. Perhaps the old gods would allow an exception now. Perhaps, for once, the Black Oath might bend to necessity. Elsewhere, well north of the dust-choked roads of King's Landing, Jon Snow learned the darkest truth a raven could ever bring. The news was delivered by Maester Aemon in a quiet hush, behind the thick walls of Castle Black. When Jon heard the words, he went silent, a thunderous emptiness in his chest. Hours passed, or so it felt, where he could not speak a single word. His father, no, his uncle, as some would say, though Jon had never questioned who Ned was to him, was gone. Robb had marched south in a show of force to free him, but the Lannisters and their boy king had severed Ned's head before any rescue could be attempted. Jon trembled with rage. He wanted to flee at once, to ride south, to drive a sword into the hearts of every Lannister dog. He wanted to stand beside Robb, because the memory of their childhood filled his heart more poignantly than any vow carved in stone. But the weight of his vow to the Night's Watch pressed on him, choking him with guilt. The words rang in his mind. I am the sword in the darkness. I am the watcher on the walls. I pledge my life and honor to the Night's Watch, for this night and all the nights to come. His vow and his sense of duty wrestled with his grief. The war inside him gave him no peace. He sought advice from Aemon Targaryen, who had faced a similar call many years before. The old man's words were kindly but implacable. Love is the death of duty, he told Jon. Yet sometimes, duty must yield for something greater if the realm is to survive. Jon did not wholly understand what Aemon meant. He only knew that his father, who had raised him, who had been a moral anchor, had died a prisoner's death. The realm was fracturing, and the North needed all the strength it could muster. Could Jon truly abandon that cause when his own father's memory cried out for retribution? Still, his vow was no trifling matter. Desertion of the Night's Watch meant death. The prospect hung over him. The watchful eyes of Ser Alliser Thorne, the unyielding command of Lord Commander Jeor Mormont. They would not let him go south easily, nor would the other brothers of the Watch, for betrayal or desertion was an affront to all. However, Lord Commander Mormont took Ned Stark's execution heavily. He knew Ned to be an honorable man, had even shown some affection for Jon as the boy had proven loyal and brave. The old bear recognized that the entire realm was falling into chaos. Lannisters, Tyrells, Baratheons, all clamoring for the Iron Throne. Meanwhile, the threat north of the Wall was ignored in the madness. Mormont saw the bigger picture. If the North fell to the Lannisters' cruelty, or if the war destroyed the Starks, the Night's Watch could lose one of its greatest lines of support. The Starks had always helped the Wall. Late one night, before the braziers in the Lord Commander's solar, Jon found Mormont in grim reflection. Jon knelt, heart pounding, prepared to ask for leave or die trying. He had made the choice in his mind. If he must desert, he would. Though it broke every vow, he could not remain idle. But Mormont surprised him. I know what you're about to say, the old bear said in his gravelly voice. And I don't fault you for it, boy. I served with your uncle, Benjen. Your father was an honorable man. The realm's grown mad. The White Walkers stir beyond the Wall. Yet the lords don't heed the warnings. I can't well march the entire Night's Watch south. But in these days, perhaps the rules must bend a bit so that they won't break entirely. Go if you must, but return. When this is over, or when you know better how to serve us all, return to the Watch. Jon was stunned silent, unsure if this was a trap. But the kindness and worry in Mormont's eyes were genuine. He was letting Jon walk away from the Wall without condemning him as a deserter, at least not officially. I will make a reason for your absence, Mormont went on. You shall remain in the Black in spirit, but perhaps your path is with your brother now. Your father's memory deserves that. The realm deserves that. For a moment, it was as if the old man's stoic facade cracked. He gave Jon a parting gift, a new sword, Longclaw, that had been given to Jon before. The pommel was a wolf's head, a memory of House Stark, yet the blade belonged to the Watch. It was all deeply symbolic. Thus freed, at least in spirit, Jon Snow left Castle Black. A few loyal companions among the Watch knew of his departure, but kept silent. He rode eastward, skirting the gift and forging a path to White Harbor, where he hoped to find a swift ship or some means of traveling without immediate notice from the Crown's forces. The risk was enormous. If anything were to happen, if word spread that a Black brother had thrown himself into the war, the Lannisters might use it as propaganda to paint the Starks as oathbreakers. But war cares little for niceties. Jon knew the realm needed him. The Starks needed him. The journey was long and cold, but each mile was lit by a small flicker of hope. Soon, he would stand beside Robb again. In feverish nights, he heard Ned Stark's voice in his dreams, not quite scolding him, but calling him toward a righteous path. By the time Jon reached White Harbor, the city was abuzz with talk of the northern banners that had marched south. The young wolf, they called Robb Stark now, word of his victories near Riverrun and his cunning at whispering behind Tywin Lannister's lines had begun to spread. Jon's chest swelled with pride. At the same time, an uneasy tightness coiled within him. War was not a glorious dance. He had seen the aftermath of battles before, and he dreaded seeing Robb steeped in it. He booked passage on a small, swift ship carrying grain and salted fish down the coast to Seaguard. From there, he meant to ride on to Riverrun or wherever Robb was encamped. Throughout the voyage, the sailors' talk was consumed with stories of the black-haired boy King Joffrey, who had so mercilessly ordered Ned Stark's beheading. Jon did not speak of his father. To these men, Ned Stark was just a name, a rumor, and the cruelty of King's Landing was far away. Once Jon finally stepped onto the docks at Seaguard, he set out at once, riding day and night to find Robb. The rumor was that Robb Stark's host had regrouped near the Twins after the capture of the Kingslayer. Lord Tywin's forces had retreated for the time being. The Tully lands were temporarily free of siege. Jon pressed on, the black cloak of the Night's Watch hidden beneath a cloak of dusty gray, hoping to avoid notice. It was not until he reached the outskirts of Robb's great camp that he realized how monumental the war effort had become. Tents sprawled over the countryside like a second city. Northern banners fluttered in the late autumn wind, each bearing sigils of wolves, bears, mermen, flayed men, and more. The smell of cooking fires, horses, and 1,000 men living in cramped conditions assaulted Jon's nose as soon as he approached. The first guard to challenge him was a tall, bearded man wearing the sunburst of House Karstark. Jon gave his name as Snow, and the guard sputtered in disbelief. "Jon Snow? You're supposed to be at the wall." But the man stepped back, uncertain. Many in the north had heard of Ned Stark's bastard, who had gone to join the Watch. The man hurried him inside, eager to bring word to King Robb. Within the hour, Jon found himself face to face with his brother in a large command tent. Robb stood around a large map-strewn table, gray wind by his side. The dire wolf eyed Jon, tail stiff, nose quivering as if unsure whether to growl or to leap in greeting. Then the beast let out a small whine and trotted forward to press his muzzle against Jon's leg. Robb stared as if seeing a ghost. The lords gathered in the tent. Great Jon Umber, Roose Bolton, Rickard Karstark, and others, stilled in silent astonishment. Jon knelt. "My king," he said, voice trembling. "I come to you." "Don't," Robb said, stepping forward, pulling Jon upright in a fierce hug. "Don't you bend the knee to me, Jon. By the gods, I'm glad to see you alive." It took a moment for them both to realize how many sets of eyes were watching. Gray wind circled them, tail swishing. Robb let Jon go and turned to the lords. "You all know my brother, Jon Snow," he said in a measured tone. "He's come to us in our time of need." The lords murmured, exchanging uneasy glances. It was no small matter, welcoming a brother of the Night's Watch into their war council. At a gesture from Robb, the lords began to filter out. Some left grudgingly, but Robb wished for a private reunion. He ushered Jon behind a partition, where food and drink were laid out on a small table. Jon's heart hammered in his chest, the moment surreal. They sat, the tension more than simple brotherly awkwardness. Each carried the weight of a new role. Robb was king in the north. His father's mantle had fallen to him in more ways than one. Jon was still a brother of the Watch, albeit one who had left his post, if not with permission then with tacit acceptance from Lord Commander Mormont. "You heard about father?" Robb asked, voice low with unspoken grief. His gaze was distant, as if perpetually fixed on that fateful moment he had read the letter describing Ned's death. Jon nodded. "A raven came to Castle Black." "Robb, I'm so sorry. Robb nodded, swallowing thickly. We tried. I truly believed we could ransom him, or that the Lannisters would keep him as a hostage. But Joffrey... He broke off, shaking his head, lips pressed tight. I've never hated anyone so much. It feels wrong to let that hatred fester, but I don't know how to let it go. Jon reached across the table, laying a hand on Robb's forearm. We'll bring justice to Joffrey, to all of them. That's why I'm here. The flicker of relief in Robb's eyes was unmistakable. Then you'll join us? I know the Watch forbids. Jon grimaced. I'm breaking the rules, Robb. I may have some measure of understanding from Lord Commander Mormont, but in truth, I don't know how this ends for me. I only know I can't stand aside while Father's killers rule. Robb clasped Jon's shoulder. Then stay at my side. We need every sword that can wield justice. The North must stand together. For a moment, Robb's voice trembled. Then he steadied himself with the composure that had begun to set him apart. I want to build a real alliance, Jon. I don't just want to avenge Father. I want to secure the future of the North. Our people deserve peace once this is done. They deserve to see that House Stark can protect them. You know, the Southern Lords, the Lannisters, can't be trusted. Father tried to do right by them and they murdered him. So from now on, we must rely on ourselves. They talked into the small hours of the night. Jon recounted the glimpses of trouble beyond the wall, the rumors of Whites and White Walkers. Robb frowned at that, uneasy. If the Watch needs help, if these White Walkers are real, the realm can't afford to tear itself apart, he said. But neither brother had a solution to that enormous threat. For now, the immediate war overshadowed everything else. The next morning, Robb called his lords to council again. Jon stood behind him, wearing a subdued version of his black attire. He did not display House Stark's sigil openly, but neither did he pretend neutrality. He was there as a brother in arms. The Northmen eyed him with varying degrees of acceptance. Some grunted that a crow was a crow, but others, like the great Jon, slapped him on the back and said, "We'll welcome any wolf blood who can hold a sword." Jon gave them a polite nod. Roose Bolton, pale and calculating, questioned Robb's decision bluntly. "Your Grace, if the crown or the rest of the realm learns that a brother of the Night's Watch is fighting for our cause, they'll paint us as oathbreakers. That might rouse the rest of the kingdoms against us." Jon stiffened at that, but Robb's face did not waver. "They already call us rebels, oathbreakers, and traitors. My father was executed as a traitor, though he was the most loyal man of the realm. And we are already fighting for our survival. Let them say what they will. Jon's sword will be a boon to our cause. And in time, I believe we can show that the Night's Watch stands with the North, not against it in these dark days." Bolton's eyes flicked to Jon, cold and unreadable. Then he bowed his head. "As you say, Your Grace." The matter was settled, or at least it would not be raised again in open council. After that, the days became a swirl of preparation and marching. Robb had a plan to move south again, crossing the river at carefully chosen spots to outmaneuver the Lannisters. He already held Jaime Lannister as a prisoner. Catelyn Stark had journeyed to treat with Renly Baratheon's new claim to the throne, or to treat with Stannis, depending on which rumor was accurate. The Game of Thrones was in full tilt across the Seven Kingdoms, but the North had a single-minded cause: avenge Ned Stark, free Sansa and Arya, if they still lived, and secure the North from future threats. Jon integrated quickly among the men. On the training fields, he sparred with younger soldiers who admired his swordsmanship and had grown up hearing that bastards could be as fierce as true-born knights. He rode with the outriders on scouts, sometimes with gray wind padding beside him, a menacing shadow. Some nights, Jon would sit by the fires, telling stories of the Wall, of ghosts and direwolves in the far north. Many were intrigued, some dismissive, but all recognized the unspoken truth. The realm was changing, old boundaries were fading, and if the North was to truly stand apart, all her sons, trueborn or bastard, Black Cloak or not, would need to be united. Then came the day Robb finally wrote to the Lords of the North still holding out in their keeps. He sent ravens north of the Neck, to White Harbor, to Bear Island, to Deepwood Motte, even to the Dreadfort, repeating his call to arms and clarifying that any brother of the Watch who wished to honor House Stark's memory could, if their superiors allowed, join in the fight. It was a controversial message. Many in the War Council considered it folly to try and recruit from the Watch. But Robb insisted, "We need strong men, and I trust the loyalty of Northern men above all. If we are to break away from the Iron Throne, or at least hold our own against it, we should unify all corners of our homeland." Jon, standing at his side, remembered Lord Commander Mormont's words and felt the slightest pang of betrayal. But Mormont had given him tacit permission. Perhaps the old man might do the same for others. Their cause began to pick up momentum. Word spread that the young wolf was not only a cunning commander but also that he welcomed northern folk of all stripes. Tales of his direwolf's ferocity reached across the land. And so, when the Northern Army began its next decisive move against Tywin Lannister's forces, a handful of Black brothers, those who, like Jon, had once felt close to House Stark, arrived in camp. They were few, but every sword helped. The war's demands were a hungry maw. It was not long before the first real test of this new unity arrived. Tywin Lannister's host had regrouped, aided by Gregor Clegane, burning their way through parts of the Riverlands. Robb decided on a swift strike. He would divide his host, send portions to harass the Lannister supply lines, while the main host lured Tywin into open battle. The rumor was that Tywin was desperate to free Jaime, or at least keep him safely imprisoned under acceptable conditions. Possibly he even hoped to capture the young wolf, break the North's morale, and end the rebellion at a stroke. Robb recognized the trap but intended to bait Tywin into a disadvantage. Jon rode at Robb's side as they moved, flanked by the Great Jon and Lord Karstark. The tension in the air was palpable. Soldiers quieted. Spearmen gripped their weapons. Knights checked and rechecked their armor. Even the horses seemed to sense the day's gravity. Jon found himself thinking of what it meant to kill for vengeance. He had killed before, to defend Lord Commander Mormont from an undead wight, for instance, but war was a different scale of bloodshed. Still, the memory of Ned's death fueled his resolve. If King Joffrey and the Lannisters faced him on the field, he would not hesitate. He felt something burn inside him, a conflagration of sorrow and fury. On a bitterly cold dawn, Robb's outriders reported the Lannister vanguard approaching across a stretch of rolling farmland. The Northmen arranged themselves on a low ridge, behind thick lines of sharpened stakes, archers on the flanks. Jon watched from his horse beside Robb, the standard of the direwolf fluttering overhead. Gray wind prowled impatiently, hungry for the fight. Trumpets echoed across the plain, sending shivers through the ranks. The Lannisters advanced, sun glinting off their armor, the lion banner gold and crimson. Far behind them, Tywin Lannister might be perched on a horse, his face stony and imperious. The battle was joined in a clamor of horns and pounding hooves. Arrows rained from the Northmen's archers. The clang of steel rang through the morning air, quickly smothered by the screams of horses and men. Jon found himself amidst it all, sword in hand, black cloak trailing behind him. In the swirl of confusion, men broke formation. Small pockets of fighting developed. Jon's heart thundered in his ears, but he kept his head, remembering the lessons taught by Ser Roderick Castle at Winterfell. Keep your feet. Stay aware of your allies. When a Lannister man-at-arms charged him, shield raised, Jon sidestepped and slid his sword below the man's guard, a quick thrust that ended him swiftly. The stench of blood was immediate. Another attacker came, this one on horseback. Jon's mount reared, and for a tense moment, the clash was too close. Then the Greatjon's enormous axe cut the horse's leg, sending man and mount tumbling. The Great Jon roared in savage glee. Jon nodded gratitude, pressing forward. He glimpsed Robb in the thick of it, fighting with a calm fury, gray wind at his side, snapping at the throats of men who strayed too near. It was as if the king and wolf were one being, each supporting the other. In the chaos, the Northmen displayed the discipline Robb had imposed. They had grown more seasoned. Tywin's men struggled to break through their lines, and soon the far flank caved under a ferocious assault from the Karstark cavalry. Jon fought on, sweat and grime coating his face, arms aching from each swing, but he would not relent. Every flash of gold and red was an enemy. Every lion was a target. Ned Stark's memory steeled his heart. Eventually, the Lannister forces wavered. Trumpets sounded a retreat. The northern men advanced, cheers rising above the din. Robb and Jon regrouped with the Great Jon, Bolton, and the others. It was not a decisive victory that annihilated Tywin's host, but it left the Lannisters severely battered, forcing them to pull back deeper into the Riverlands. Cheers erupted for the king in the north. Men raised swords, crying, "The young wolf, the king in the north!" And they cheered Jon Snow as well, for his bravery. A bond was forming among the northern host, a sense that they were unstoppable, protected by the old gods. That night, Jon found himself sitting in Robb's command tent once more, but this time the mood was triumphant. Robb was covered in dust and blood, minor cuts on his arms, but his spirits were high. Over a simple meal of bread and salted beef, they dissected the events of the day. "We hurt Tywin badly," Robb said. "He won't risk a pitched battle again without reinforcements. That gives us time to fortify our position and maybe open negotiations for the girls." Jon's eyes flickered. "They're in King's Landing, right? Sansa, Arya." Just speaking their names tightened his throat. He had not seen his sisters since he had left for the Wall. Arya had been so small, full of fierce energy. And Sansa, older, who loved songs of gallant knights. Now they were trapped in the Viper's Nest. Robb nodded grimly. "I have to try to bring them home. Cersei might use them as hostages, or Joffrey might do worse. Our only real leverage at the moment is that we have Jaime. Mother is already working to see if we can arrange a trade. But with the Boy King on the throne, anything could happen." He paused, eyes flicking to Jon's face. "Jon, I swear to you, we will free them or die trying." Jon swallowed. "I'm with you. Always." In the days that followed, letters arrived from Catelyn Stark, from Renly Baratheon, from Stannis, each bearing rumors or proposals. Renly wanted Robb to bend the knee in exchange for recognition of the North's autonomy. Stannis demanded fealty under the true line of succession. Robb considered them all carefully, conferring with his lords. Some pressed him to join Renly's cause, believing that a charismatic king with the support of the Tyrells might better guarantee the North's independence. Others insisted that Stannis, though severe, was more lawful, and if offered help, might treat the North fairly. Still others said the North should stand alone, forging no new feudal alliances. Throughout it all, Jon was torn. He had never dreamed of the North becoming its own kingdom, and yet it stirred something deep in him to imagine a free North, governed by a Stark. He had no illusions that it would be easy. The Lannisters would never cede the North peacefully. The rest of the Southern Lords might still attempt to reimpose the Iron Throne's dominion. War was the only foreseeable path. Jon prayed to the old gods that it wouldn't become an endless cycle of bloodshed. Meanwhile, the presence of a handful of Black brothers within the northern host stirred controversy in other circles. Some whispered that it was an abomination, a sign that the North had turned its back on tradition. Others saw it as a necessary measure, given the treachery in the South. If the Watch's original purpose was to defend the realm from threats beyond the Wall, but the realm itself was tearing House Stark apart, perhaps it was time to reconsider the black and white lines drawn centuries ago. Jon remained uneasy, but each day he fought alongside good men. Each day he shared bread with them. It felt more right than sitting idle at the Wall. A few times, Jon recalled Mormont's parting words, "Return to the Watch when you can." He wondered if it would ever be possible. If the war ended, if the North truly became independent, what would become of the Night's Watch? The questions hovered, unanswered. Amid these uncertainties, a dire raven arrived for Robb from the twins. It carried chilling news. There were rumblings that Walder Frey, displeased that Robb had not held up certain marriage pacts quickly enough, was considering shifting his allegiance. He was rumored to be in correspondence with Tywin Lannister, perhaps seeking a better bargain. Robb's face darkened when he read the message. "We must not let that bridge slip away from us," he declared. The Frey's castle, the twins, was vital to crossing the Green Fork of the Trident. Should Walder Frey ally with the Lannisters, it would choke the North's lines of communication. Robb made the decision to head to the twins with a contingent of men, and with Jon. He wanted a show of Stark unity, a reminder of House Stark's might. They left Roose Bolton to hold Riverrun's perimeter, while the rest marched. The travel was grueling, autumn storms turning roads to mud, but eventually, they arrived at the looming structure of the twins. Its twin castles faced each other across the water, joined by the massive stone bridge. Walder Frey, old and cunning, awaited them with a retinue of brood and bannermen. Jon had never liked the Freys. He remembered them from King Robert's visit to Winterfell, or from occasional glimpses at feasts when they visited. Their sly manner, the abundance of half-grown children scampering about, the arrogance of that old lord. The moment they were inside, Walder Frey greeted Robb with a show of forced courtesy. "Your Grace," he said, bowing stiffly. "I hear you've made quite the name for yourself, the young wolf. I trust my dear granddaughter is still prepared to wed you, after the war." He cackled, glancing at the assembled northern lords. Jon could see Robb stiffen, recalling the promise that had forced him to betroth himself to one of Frey's daughters. But he answered politely, "Yes, of course, my lord. The war has complicated matters, but I have not forgotten." Jon inwardly noted how quickly the lie came to Robb's lips. Because Catelyn's letter had hinted that Robb's heart might be turning elsewhere, some rumor about a Westerling girl. The tension was palpable. Walder Frey's gaze swept over Jon, eyes narrowing. "And you're the Snow bastard, aren't you? Or a black brother, maybe. Hard to keep track of all the crows and wolves these days." The old man's tone dripped with condescension. Jon bit back a retort. "I am Jon Snow, yes. So it's true then, the Night's Watch is fighting in your war, King Robb? Interesting times we live in. Very interesting indeed." He made a show of rubbing his chin, as if weighing how to use this tidbit. The entire conversation felt like stepping across a floor of thin ice. Jon saw the flicker of ambition in the old man's eyes. Walder Frey was always searching for advantage. Robb wasted no time. He demanded a private audience, where he laid out his concerns. "I have heard worrying rumors that you've been in correspondence with Tywin Lannister. I trust that is not true, Lord Frey." Walder Frey spread his palms in mock protest. "Rumors, only rumors. A man in my position must keep a line of communication with all sides. Yet, I have pledged to your cause, have I not? Provided, of course, you keep to your promises, particularly the one about marrying one of my precious girls." The old man's cunning was obvious. He wanted to bind Robb to the Freys, ensuring the future king would be beholden. The friction was clear to Jon. Robb had cornered himself with a vow, an oath he likely had no intention to keep in truth. The thought of the consequences chilled Jon, but it was not his place to speak now. He stood behind Robb, arms crossed, watching Walder's every twitch, ignoring the stares of Frey guards who eyed his black attire suspiciously. In the end, Walder Frey was mollified for the moment. Robb swore again that once the war was over, he would honor the marriage pact. To seal the courtesy, Walder insisted on hosting a feast for Robb's retinue. That night, the hall of the twins rang with forced merriment. Frey wives, daughters, and granddaughters paraded about, casting hopeful looks at Robb. Some cast curious glances at Jon as well, but a black cloak carried no such allure. Jon sat, sipping watered wine, feeling ill at ease. Something about the twins filled him with foreboding. The tension in the air was thick, as though betrayal could be found in every corner. Despite these uneasy dealings, Walder Frey permitted the king in the north safe passage south once more, taking care to mention that if any further rumor of betrayal reached his ears, he might have to rethink his allegiances. Robb forced a thin smile, making empty assurances. The Northmen departed the following day with no illusions about the Frey's loyalty. If a better offer came from the Lannisters, Walder Frey would likely turn his cloak. Robb was determined not to let that happen. He considered taking a few of Walder's heirs as wards, but decided the old man would see that as an insult. So they parted ways uncertain. They marched onward. The next objective was Harrenhal, which Tywin Lannister had abandoned some time ago, leaving it in the hands of various loyalists. Roose Bolton had taken it in the original timeline. In this version of events, with Jon at Robb's side, the plan was slightly different. Robb wanted to hold Harrenhal as a strategic point, a strong fortress near the heart of the Riverlands that could threaten King's Landing from the west. The seat itself was cursed, or so they said, haunted by the ghosts of Harren the Black. But that did not deter the northern host. If anything, the monstrous melted towers of Harrenhal loomed as a testament to old wars, an ominous reminder of what dragons once did. Now, in these new wars, men with steel and cunning would decide its fate. They arrived to find the fortress lightly held by a band of mercenaries and ragged Lannister loyalists. A quick battle ensued outside the gates. The Northmen smashed the small defense, and Jon fought again, side by side with Robb. As they pressed inside, they discovered that many of the peasants in Harrenhal had been neglected, starved, or terrified. Robb commanded that they be fed, that any who wished to leave could do so in peace. The haunting corridors and large, vacant halls of Harrenhal swallowed the northern army. They established a presence, setting up guard rotations, scouring for leftover Lannister partisans in the labyrinth of halls and cellars. Jon found himself assigned to search the cellars and dungeons. It was grim work. The memory of Ned's imprisonment gnawed at him. But in those damp cells, among rats and filth, he discovered no living prisoners, only bones. Above ground, the courtyard was abuzz with the sounds of forging, horses, men shouting orders. Harrenhal was a fortress, but it was also a trap in the wrong hands. The question was how long Robb planned to hold it, given that winter was on the horizon. War councils resumed. Roose Bolton, summoned from Riverrun, arrived within days, stepping into the swirl of Harrenhal's uncertain gloom. He offered to remain there as Castellan, just as in the original timeline. Robb was hesitant, but he needed someone capable of organizing supply lines and maintaining a foothold. Bolton volunteered, perhaps too readily for Jon's liking. But in the end, Robb agreed. Jon watched Bolton carefully. The Lord of the Dreadfort was pale, soft-spoken, and polite. He rarely showed any strong emotion. With each passing day, Jon became more wary of him. Men whispered that Roose Bolton was as cruel as any Lannister, perhaps crueler. Yet, outwardly, he pledged undying loyalty to the king in the north. For the time being, Robb had little choice but to trust him. War forced unlikely alliances, and the dire need overshadowed personal misgivings. Meanwhile, the conflict with House Lannister ground on. Tywin's battered forces hovered around the edges of the Riverlands, unable to challenge Robb directly. News from King's Landing, however, was dire. Joffrey was said to be entertaining sadistic amusements in the Red Keep, tormenting Sansa Stark. Arya's whereabouts were uncertain. Some said she had escaped the city, others that she was hidden away. The capital seethed under the stress of war and the threat of Stannis, who was rumored to be mustering ships at Dragonstone. The realm was fracturing like a block of ice under a chisel. One evening, Robb and Jon sat in Harrenhal's largest tower room, an antechamber near the Old Lord's solar. The walls were thick stone, partly melted by dragonfire centuries ago, giving them a warped, eerie shape. A single window overlooked a vast courtyard. Robb read through a series of letters. Jon stood by, silent, not wanting to intrude. Finally, Robb spoke in a hushed tone. "I have word from Mother. She's met with Renly. He's demanded we bend the knee. In return, he will declare me Warden of the North, vow to punish the Lannisters, and recognize the Starks' right to autonomy in all but name. She says he might be open to a more equitable arrangement, but I'd have to do homage." "That stings, Jon." Jon exhaled. "You wanted a free North?" "Aye, but if we continue alone, we might face every Southern lord in arms. With Stannis and Renly both claiming the throne, there's no telling how the lines will shift. And all the while, my sisters remain captive. If an alliance with Renly shortens the war and frees them, He trailed off. I just don't know. Should I bow to a man who has no right to the throne, or at least no better right than Stannis? Jon hesitated. Politics was not his strong suit. Finally, he said, Father always believed in the rightful king, in law and order. Stannis is the elder Baratheon, the one Robert named as heir, or so we believed. But Father also believed in avoiding senseless war. Which path is more honorable might not be the path that saves the most lives. This is war, Robb. Perhaps the question is, which path will bring about what the North needs, vengeance and safety for our people? Robb rubbed his temples. I don't want to put you in a position of giving counsel like a lord. That's not fair to you or to your vows. I'm already in that position, Robb, Jon said, half smiling. And the vows? Let's just say I'm still a brother of the Watch in my heart, but I'm here for House Stark first. They shared a look of mutual understanding. Through the battered windows, the autumn sky showed hints of stars, clouds drifting across a half-moon. The ancient stone around them seemed to whisper with ghosts. For a moment, the two young men, who once had been boys playing in the courtyard of Winterfell, felt the crushing weight of leadership, the inexorable pull of duty. And though each had chosen a different path, Robb, the king in the north, Jon, the black brother turned war companion, they stood together. The next day, as if the gods were mocking their indecision, word came that Stannis had declared himself the rightful king of Westeros, backed by Melisandre, a red priestess of R'hllor. Storm's End was under his banner. The lords of the Stormlands were torn between him and Renly, who had the backing of the Tyrells. Another letter from Catelyn described the matter as a swirl of alliances and tensions. She urged Robb to consider supporting one of the Baratheon brothers. With Tywin Lannister reeling, this was the moment to unite the realm against King Joffrey, or so she believed. Robb called his banners to a new council. They argued late into the night. Great Jon Umber favored marching on King's Landing at once, using the confusion to seize the city and free the Stark girls. Lord Karstark demanded that Jaime Lannister be executed as revenge for the death of his own sons, yet recognized that Jaime was their best bargaining chip. Roose Bolton, ever calm, suggested letting Renly and Stannis fight each other, then dealing with whoever emerged. Jon stood back, arms folded, his eyes flicking to each speaker, disquiet gnawing at him. War had a momentum of its own, and each choice carried a web of consequences. In the end, Robb decided on a more cautious approach. He would send envoys to both Renly and Stannis, gauging their willingness to allow the North to remain independent. He would demand the release of Sansa and Arya as a condition of any alliance. In the meantime, he would hold Harrenhal and keep Tywin cornered in the west, preventing him from rallying. The plan was not the swift vengeance that Great Jon desired, but it seemed prudent. The lords acquiesced. Time stretched on. The days at Harrenhal blended into each other, a tense waiting. Jon trained soldiers in swordplay, taught them how to move silently through corridors, shared what meager knowledge he had gleaned from the Watch. In quiet moments, he prayed before the old weirwood heart tree in the Godswood. Although Harrenhal's Godswood was a grim place, the weirwood's face twisted in centuries of anguish. There, Jon thought of Ned Stark, prayed for the safety of his sisters, for the North, for a path of honor in a world that seemed to sneer at the word. Ghost, his direwolf, had remained at Castle Black in the original timeline, but in this story it might be different. Perhaps Ghost had accompanied him, if we assume so. Then Ghost, white as snow, would sometimes stalk the ramparts of Harrenhal, a silent sentinel. The men were nearly as wary of the wolf as they were of Grey Wind, though Ghost was less aggressive. Even so, the dire presence of these wolves reminded them the Starks were not to be trifled with. At last, a raven returned from Renly Baratheon's camp near Highgarden. He offered to accept Robb's kingship in the North in name, if Robb would accept him as the rightful king of the Seven Kingdoms in a formal sense. The details were labyrinthine. Renly suggested a formal alliance by marriage as well, perhaps a union between Sansa Stark, once freed, and a favored Tyrell or Baratheon cousin. It was as if the entire war had become a series of betrothal bargains. Robb read the letter, brow furrowed. He looked at Jon. He's offering me recognition as king in the north if I swear fealty to him as king of the entire realm. It's contradictory. He's basically saying I can be a king in name only, but must do homage. A king who kneels is no king at all. Jon shook his head. Your lords will never accept that. They crowned you their king precisely to avoid kneeling to any southern throne. If you do so, you'll lose their support. Robb sighed. True, but if it helps us gain the upper hand, if it ends this war sooner, maybe it's worth it. Before they could discuss further, another raven arrived, this one from Stannis. His message was more severe. He accused Robb of treason for styling himself king, yet recognized that the Lannisters were the greater evil. He offered to pardon Robb if he would submit to the true Iron Throne under Stannis, in which case the North would receive certain privileges, though not full independence. The letter dripped with condescension. It was worse than Renly's offer in many ways, and so the choice stood. Renly offered a nominal independence overshadowed by southern politics. Stannis demanded subordination in exchange for some autonomy. Neither was truly offering a free North in the spirit that the lords desired. Meanwhile, King's Landing was in chaos. Joffrey rumored to be losing the support of half his own court due to his cruelty. The war waged on sporadically. Raids, skirmishes, the steady attrition of supplies. Winter threatened ever closer. In hushed corners of Harrenhal, men wondered how long the king in the north could keep up this fight. Others believed that a final blow, taking King's Landing, capturing Joffrey, would end it in one stroke. But to do that meant contending with the Baratheon forces as well. The realm was splintered in all directions. One late autumn morning, a host of outriders brought urgent news. Tywin Lannister was on the move again, forging an alliance with the remnants of House Tully's rebellious lords who blamed the North for not protecting their lands quickly enough. The outriders insisted Tywin was pushing east, perhaps to recapture Riverrun. Robb would not allow that. Summoning his men, he prepared for a swift march. I must protect Uncle Brynden and Edmure. The Riverlands are loyal to us, he told Jon. If they see us leaving them to Tywin's mercy, we'll lose their trust. Jon nodded. I'm with you. They marched from Harrenhal, leaving Roose Bolton once again to garrison it with a respectable force. Gray wind bounded ahead of the column. The crisp air stung their faces, the promise of winter in every gust. It took them a week to reach the outskirts of Riverrun, the journey slowed by wagons and foot soldiers. Upon arrival, they saw the Lannister banners across the waters, a sea of red and gold. Tywin had moved quickly, forging a siege around Riverrun's walls. The castle's drawbridge was raised, but the defenders were pinned. Edmure Tully's men had put up a staunch defense, but the lines were dangerously thin. Robb wasted no time. He devised a plan to surprise Tywin's camp at dawn. The Northmen would cross the river upstream under the cover of darkness, circle around, and strike from the rear, while a smaller force made a diversion at the front. The Great Jon and Karstark swelled with anticipation. Jon felt the adrenaline roil in his gut. Another battle, another chance to test the might of the king in the north. When dawn broke, horns sounded a cry across the misty fields. The Northmen's surprise attack fell upon the Lannister rearguard in a furious clash. The tramp of boots, the clatter of steel, the screams cut the morning air. Robb led the vanguard, gray wind at his side. Jon was with the outriders, driving into the camp from an angle, cutting down sentries before they fully roused. Tents caught fire. Men stumbled from them half-armored. The Riverlands men inside Riverrun saw their chance and sallied forth, crashing into the Lannister lines from the opposite side. Caught between hammer and anvil, Tywin's forces reeled. Jon fought through the chaos, trying to keep track of Robb's banner amid the swirling confusion. Several times, he nearly lost himself in the melee. He killed 3 Lannister soldiers, blocking the blow of a 4th by pivoting his horse just in time. Splashes of blood and mud coated his cloak. A man swung an axe at him, denting Jon's breastplate but glancing off. Jon lunged, burying Longclaw in the attacker's belly. He felt a sickening lurch as the man screamed and collapsed. War was horror, but no part of him flinched now. He had chosen this path. From the fortress walls, Edmure Tully's archers rained arrows onto the retreating Lannisters. By midday, the battle was all but won. Tywin Lannister himself managed to escape with his personal guard, disappearing into the western roads. The North and Riverrun allies were left battered but victorious. The field was strewn with corpses, horses whimpering, tents aflame. Robb oversaw the triage, trying to save as many wounded as he could, both friend and foe, for he was not a cruel king. For that, the Riverlanders praised him. "The young wolf is as honorable as his father," they said. Jon felt pride at that, though tears pricked his eyes to think of Ned. In the aftermath, Edmure Tully and the Blackfish welcomed Robb and Jon into Riverrun's Great Hall. They exchanged reports, learning that small pockets of Lannister loyalists had begun to desert, growing weary of Joffrey's tyranny. Yet the question remained: how to end the war? The Tullys pressed Robb for a decisive strike. "Ride south, link up with whichever Baratheon might support your cause," they urged. "End this madness by taking King's Landing." Robb found himself trapped in the same dilemma. He frowned, stroking Grey Wind's thick fur. To move on King's Landing is to risk confronting both Baratheon forces. Unless we can secure a real alliance, we may fight a war on two fronts. Jon listened quietly. He felt sure that if the Lannisters were broken, the realm could be stabilized, at least enough to retrieve Arya and Sansa. Wasn't that the heart of their quest? Their father's memory demanded justice. That night, in a small chamber offered to him, Jon removed his armor, wincing at bruises. He sank onto a narrow bed, exhausted. The candlelight flickered, sending shadows dancing across the walls. His thoughts drifted to the wall. Had Mormont discovered more threats from the White Walkers? Did Samwell Tarly wonder where Jon had gone? The realm was so large, its troubles so many. And here Jon was, locked in a southern war. "But father," Jon whispered. His father was gone. The war was about ensuring his death was not meaningless. A gentle scratch came at the door. Jon opened it to find Robb, equally exhausted, but with a determined set to his jaw. "Jon, I need your help. We're meeting again. The Lords want me to make a choice about forging a new alliance. Will you come and speak your mind?" Jon hesitated. "I'm no lord, Robb, but you're my brother." There was a rawness in Robb's tone that brooked no refusal. So they went together to the Solar, where Edmure, the Blackfish, the Great Jon, Karstark, and other key lords had gathered. Catelyn Stark had returned from her fruitless attempts at bridging alliances with Stannis and Renly. She sat at Robb's side, her face drawn with worry. When Jon entered, she gave him a tight smile of acknowledgement. She had once disdained him as Ned's bastard, but the war had changed many things. Catelyn reported that Renly and Stannis seemed on the verge of open conflict with each other. Neither would concede the throne, and King's Landing, under the boy King Joffrey, was preparing its own defenses. "This war might tear the entire realm asunder," she said gravely. "The North will bleed, the Riverlands will bleed, everyone will bleed. Robb, we must find a way to save Sansa and Arya before the capital becomes a battleground." The lords murmured in agreement, some in frustration. Finally, Robb turned to Jon. "Brother, you fought beside me. You know the cost of war. What should we do? Press for King's Landing alone? Ally with Renly or Stannis? Or hold our ground? Wait for them to destroy each other?" All eyes fell on Jon. He swallowed. "I can only speak from the heart. We want justice for Lord Stark, we want your sisters free. That means confronting the Lannisters eventually. But we have to be sure we don't replace one tyrant with another. If we ally with Renly, we might free the girls sooner, but he might not truly respect the North's independence. Stannis might be more lawful, but less forgiving of the North's claim to be separate. And waiting while they destroy each other could risk Sansa and Arya being caught in the crossfire." Great Jon Umber barked. "We should just march on King's Landing, burn the place to the ground if we must, and pull the girls out by force." Catelyn's eyes flashed. "We cannot risk their lives by a direct assault that might get them killed." Karstark said, "My sons died fighting the Lannisters. Every day we wait, their memories go unavenged." Voices erupted. each lord speaking over the other. Robb raised a hand, calling for calm. He turned to his mother. "Mother, in your judgment, do you trust Renly or Stannis to keep their word about the girls? Which is more likely to allow the North its freedom?" Catelyn sighed. "Renly is charming, but I am not convinced of his commitment to the North. Stannis is rigid, but if he sees a lawful reason to allow the North its king, perhaps he might concede, though I doubt it. He sees all as subjects of the Iron Throne. But Joffrey and Cersei are the worst monsters. If they remain in power, the girls are not safe." Robb's hand curled into a fist. He closed his eyes for a moment. Then he said quietly, "I will propose a truce with both Stannis and Renly, if only to coordinate a rescue or an exchange for my sisters. If they are unwilling, I'll consider a direct approach. We can't let them remain as pawns in King's Landing forever." His voice trembled with suppressed rage. The council broke up with no definitive solution, but a plan to at least attempt further negotiation. Catelyn volunteered again to undertake the mission. Robb nodded. "One more time, Mother. But if it fails, we'll have to act." Amid these complicated maneuvers, the war ground on with smaller battles. The roads of the Riverlands became graveyards for the unlucky. Refugees fled in all directions. The crops burned. Winter's chill drew closer, and the nights lengthened. Through it all, Jon remained a steadfast presence at Robb's side, becoming a trusted sword and advisor in matters both military and personal. Though some lords still grumbled about a black brother in their midst, many had come to respect him after witnessing his bravery in battle. Weeks passed, and at last, Catelyn returned from an abortive parley. She came with grim news. Renly and Stannis were indeed at each other's throats. The siege of Storm's End was rumored, though details were murky. King's Landing was fortifying. A new rumor claimed that Tywin Lannister was forging an alliance with the Tyrells in secret. Another rumor said that the Greyjoys of the Iron Islands were preparing to strike the north in the midst of the chaos. There would be no easy resolution. The land was fracturing into 100 pieces. One evening, Robb called Jon to a private conversation in Riverrun's Godswood. They stood beneath a large oak near the water's edge, with gray wind pacing behind them. Robb's expression was taut with anxiety. "Jon, I've been thinking about Father, about all he stood for. He believed in the realm, in justice, in protecting the weak. Now the realm is devouring itself. If we keep going down this path, the North might survive, but thousands more will die, including, possibly, your brothers in the Watch if the supplies from the North are cut off. Or what if the others come and find us so weakened that we can't resist?" Jon listened, heart heavy. The Watch is already starved for men and resources. If the Great War beyond the Wall is real, we'll need the entire realm united. But how to unite it under these conditions? Robb exhaled. "I don't know. The only thing I'm certain of is that we can't let Joffrey's crime go unanswered. Father can't remain unavenged. But is there a way to punish them without subjecting the entire realm to endless war?" He paused, searching Jon's face. "I wonder sometimes if I'm not the man Father would want me to be. Perhaps there was a way to negotiate to keep him alive. Maybe I should have bent the knee long ago and tried to free him with a ransom. But it's too late for that now." Jon placed a hand on Robb's shoulder. "Father would never blame you. He taught us both to do what is right. And sometimes that means fighting when there's no other choice." Robb looked away, tears threatening. "I'd give anything to have him back. Or to have Theon and the others here again. The old days at Winterfell." They lapsed into silence, remembering simpler times. Eventually, Robb squared his shoulders. "We march south," he said. "We'll deal with Tywin if we must, and we'll attempt to cut off King's Landing from the west. If the Baratheons want to fight among themselves, so be it, but I'll offer them a final chance at alliance. Let them unite with me to dethrone Joffrey, or we do it ourselves. We can't linger forever while the realm burns." Jon nodded, though apprehension coiled in his chest. The next phase would bring them closer to the heart of the Lion's Den, closer to the real seat of Lannister power. The cost in blood would be high, but if it meant liberating Sansa, if it meant avenging Ned, it might be the only path left. In a fortnight, the northern host was on the move again, gathering at Riverrun's gates. Catelyn parted ways once more, heading for an uncertain rendezvous with Renly's forces, while Robb led the main army eastward. The banners flew. The direwolf of Stark, the roaring bear of Mormont, the sunburst of Karstark, the flayed man of Bolton, the giant of Umber, the merman of Manderley, and others. Jon rode near the front, cloak drawn tight against the chill, gray wind loping beside them. With each step of his horse, with each day that passed, he reminded himself of why they did this. For Ned, for Sansa, for Arya, for the North. The weight of those reasons pressed on him. He had left the Night's Watch behind, but in spirit he still carried the vow. He hoped one day, when all this was over, he might return and help defend the Wall from the real threat. Perhaps, if the realm was united, they could face the darkness beyond. But for now, vengeance and family took priority. So the army of the North descended deeper into the war-torn lands, forging a path that would change the fate of Westeros one way or another. They did not know, as they rode, that Walder Frey was already sending secret letters to Tywin, that Roose Bolton was entertaining quiet communications with an unknown party, that Theon Greyjoy might soon betray them in another direction entirely. They only knew that they were brothers, bastard and trueborn, united in a cause that felt righteous. And so began the next stage of the war for the North, a war that had ignited the moment Ned Stark lost his head on the steps of the Great September in King's Landing, a war now powered by the combined will of Robb Stark and Jon Snow, forging a new path in blood and hope. Far to the north, in the silent wind-scoured expanses beyond the Wall, another conflict gathered strength. But that is a story for another time. Here, in the Riverlands and the approach to King's Landing, the fate of the Stark family, reborn as the king in the north and the Crowwolf at his side, would be decided in the crucible of war. Their story, intertwined with the future of the Seven Kingdoms, was just beginning. And with each clang of steel, each beat of their hearts, they remembered the words of House Stark. Winter is coming. They pressed on through the Riverlands, carrying the battered banners of their houses under skies that threatened rain and worse. The column of northern soldiers stretched long along the winding roads, a serpent of steel and horseflesh. Knights rode in the van, their armor dulled by travel yet proud enough to mark them as Northmen. Archers and foot soldiers slogged behind, caked in mud. Carts rattled with provisions and wounded men. The mood was somber, as if all the songs of glory had been drained away by too many battles. Robb Stark rode near the head of the host, gray wind prowling beside his horse. The direwolf's ears twitched, vigilant for any sign of threat. Occasionally, Robb would glance back over the thousands who had pledged themselves to him. They followed out of love for House Stark, out of outrage at Ned Stark's murder, out of pride in the North's newfound independence. But war was an endless wait, especially now that the crisp edge of autumn had grown sharper. Some nights, even the frost underfoot reminded them all that winter would not wait forever, and that the men who froze under southern rains could hardly endure the snows to come. Jon Snow rode at Robb's side. His black cloak blended with the dark fur of his collar, though he still felt odd mixing the colors and symbols of two worlds. The Night's Watch he had once sworn to, and the wolves of House Stark, the only true family he had ever known. He had abandoned the Wall, albeit with Lord Commander Mormont's tacit blessing, and the guilt still gnawed at him, especially when he remembered Samwell Tarly and the others who remained to guard against terrors beyond the Wall. But every time Jon's doubts troubled him, he called forth the memory of Ned Stark's face, and of how the crown had mounted Ned's head on a spike. That memory turned his blood to iron. The war might be an awful, devouring beast, but letting the Lannisters keep their spoils was unthinkable. Jon was here for Robb, for Sansa, for Arya, for all the Starks, living and dead. They had decided to skirt Harrenhal again, moving east to keep watch on the roads that led toward King's Landing. Though Roose Bolton held Harrenhal with a sizable garrison, ravens brought word that Tywin Lannister was regrouping further south, possibly in alliance with the Tyrells. Renly Baratheon. Hien had marched his armies from Highgarden toward Storm's End, and Stannis was rumored to be besieging his own brother or preparing to. Catelyn Stark's repeated attempts at forging a compromise had failed. A new rumor claimed that Renly might soon face Stannis in a decisive clash, a rumor that left Robb uneasy. If one Baratheon brother defeated the other swiftly, the victor might then march on King's Landing unopposed, leaving the North out of any terms. That could also mean the Lannisters would scramble for new allies or sacrifice Sansa and Arya in a final act of spite. All was uncertainty, but one thing burned clear in Robb's mind. They must gain enough leverage to secure the release of the Stark girls. Even with Jaime Lannister in custody, the negotiations remained stalled. Cersei played her own games at court, evidently believing she could endure the threat from the North and from the Baratheons alike. Joffrey, perched on the Iron Throne, was too cruel and inexperienced to appreciate the dangers closing in. Or perhaps he simply enjoyed the spectacle of war and the suffering of Ned Stark's daughters. On the 5th day of their eastward march, the rains fell. They came as a cold torrent from low, bruised clouds, soaking cloaks and turning roads into rivers of mud. Progress slowed to a miserable crawl. Soldiers wrapped scraps of cloth around their boots, cursing the biting damp. Campfires sputtered each evening, barely coaxed to life by men who huddled in half-flooded hollows. Grey Wind prowled among them, muzzle dripping, his breath steaming in the raw chill. The dire wolf seemed to sense the looming tension, that each step took them farther from any safe haven. Jon's horse struggled in the muck. He cursed softly, remembering the more straightforward cold of Castle Black. At least there, the ground was frozen solid rather than this endless mire. But he said nothing aloud. Everyone was in the same state. Some of the outriders returned, bringing tidings that a cluster of broken men, likely Lannister deserters, were raiding local farmsteads in search of food. Robb dispatched small cavalry units to chase them off, mindful that any new foe could disrupt their supply lines. One evening, as the rain tapered to a miserable drizzle, Robb ordered a war council beneath the largest tent they had been able to pitch in the sodden earth. Torchlight danced on the tent walls. Lords crowded inside, smelling of wet wool and unwashed bodies. Great Jon Umber slapped mud from his cloak, cursing the weather in loud, brash tones. Rickard Karstark stood silent, eyes hollow since losing his sons to Jaime Lannister's sword long ago. A handful of other northern lords and knights ringed Robb's field table, and Jon stood slightly behind his brother, half in shadow. Robb studied the map by flickering candlelight. "I've received ravens from Riverrun," he began. "They confirm Tywin Lannister is indeed negotiating with the Tyrells. Mace Tyrell, apparently uncertain about Renly's chances, may be entertaining an offer from the Lannisters to marry Margaery Tyrell to King Joffrey." He glanced up. "If that alliance solidifies, we'll have the combined forces of the Reach and the West bearing down on us. We can't allow that to happen unchallenged." Great Jon Umber slammed a meaty fist against his thigh. "We should strike first, Your Grace. March on King's Landing before the Tyrells can muster. Let them meet us on the field if they want to fight." Karstark cleared his throat. "We'd need to cross the Blackwater or come around through Rosby or Duskendale. Either route means we're on southern ground, with no sure allies. Our supply lines would stretch precariously. We might find ourselves pinned between Lannister forces and Tyrell cavalry. And what of the Baratheons? We don't know if Stannis or Renly might attack us as well." A ripple of grumbling passed around the tent. Robb pressed his palms against the table. "It's a risk, but we're running out of time. Once the Tyrells join the Lannisters, they may crush Stannis and Renly both. Then they'll turn their full might on the north. Meanwhile, my sisters still languish in King's Landing. Every day we wait is another day Joffrey might choose to use them as a spectacle for his cruelty." Jon found himself speaking up, though he tried not to overstep. "Your Grace, perhaps we can send an envoy to the Tyrells. If we convince them that the North will stand on its own, maybe we can promise them something in return for not allying with the Lannisters. Remind them that the Lannisters' gold does not guarantee victory, especially with so many foes on every side. And Margaery marrying Joffrey, I doubt that's an alliance they'll trust. Joffrey's cruelty is no secret." Robb nodded slowly. You're suggesting we entice Mace Tyrell away from the Lion with the idea that House Stark is more honorable, more stable? Or at least show that if he sides with the Lannisters, he'll be fighting a war on multiple fronts, with uncertain spoils, Jon clarified. Great Jon scratched his beard. I've no love for Tyrells, but if it keeps them from bolstering the Lannisters, it's worth trying. A Tyrell who sits out the war is better than a Tyrell who fights us. Karstark muttered agreement, though his eyes flickered with disdain at the notion of dealing with Southerners. Some of the lesser lords nodded grudgingly. Robb let out a long breath. Then we try. I'll send a messenger to Highgarden or to wherever Mace Tyrell is encamped. We must act swiftly. If the Tyrells rebuff us, we'll reconsider marching on King's Landing. We can't remain in this limbo. Winter is coming. The meeting broke up with no final resolution, but a sense of uneasy forward motion. The next morning, the rain slackened enough for the host to trudge onward. Robb sent out a swift rider under a flag of truce, tasked with finding the Tyrell main force. That done, he pressed the army southeast, aiming to position them closer to the Crownlands, if and when the time came to strike. Each day brought fresh rumors. Some outriders reported that Renly Baratheon had been killed under mysterious circumstances. Stabbed by a shadow, men whispered. Others insisted Renly still lived but had lost half his camp to desertion. Stannis was said to be massing ships at Storm's End, preparing to sail for King's Landing. The entire realm was like a tinderbox, sparks flying in every direction. At dusk one day, as the northern host set up camp near the ruins of an old sept, Jon spotted a lone rider approaching from the west at a gallop. The guards scrambled, weapons drawn, until they recognized the sigil on the rider's cloak. A mailed fist, House Glover of Deepwood Motte. The man nearly collapsed from his horse, exhausted, and demanded to speak to King Robb at once. Robb emerged from his tent, cloak billowing in a gust of cool wind. Gray Wind stood at his side, lips curled slightly as he caught the rider's scent. Jon joined them, boots crunching on gravel. The rider, still panting, fell to one knee. Your Grace, I bring dire news from the north. The Ironborn have landed. They're raiding our coasts. I fear it's worse than that. They've taken Torrhen's Square, and they may be moving on Winterfell. Robb's face went white with shock. Theon, he murmured. He had sent Theon Greyjoy back to Pike to broker an alliance, hoping to secure the Iron Fleet against the Lannisters. It can't be true. He wouldn't. But his voice trailed off. Betrayal hung in the air like a rotting stench. Theon had been raised as a ward of House Stark, but Balon Greyjoy had never truly submitted to the Iron Throne. Now, with the realm in chaos, the Ironborn would seize any chance to strike. Are you certain? The rider nodded, wincing. Certain, Your Grace. The Greyjoys have raised their Kraken banners. They mean to carve out their own kingdom while the South is embroiled. Deepwood Motte is next, or so we believe. Lords Bolton and Manderley might try to rally a defense, but half the fighting men are here with you. Robb stood rigid, warring emotions crossing his features. My brothers, Bran and Rickon, are in Winterfell. They must be protected. His eyes darted to Jon, who felt a sudden stab of fear for his younger brothers. They were children, and Winterfell was lightly guarded. A hush descended on the gathered men. The great Jon stepped forward, voice grave. Theon Greyjoy is a treacherous dog if this is true. We'll make him pay for this. But Your Grace, we can't abandon the war in the south. We're close to final moves here. If we retreat north, the Lannisters might strike behind us. Karstark said bitterly. My lord, we swore to protect the north first and foremost. The safety of Winterfell is everything. How can we call ourselves king in the north if the Ironborn hold our seat? A tumult of opinions erupted. Some demanded an immediate march home. Others counseled to press on, believing that a small contingent might suffice to retake Winterfell while Robb finished the war in the south. Robb's face was grim, lines of worry etched deep. We have an obligation to all of our people, he said. The Ironborn cannot hold the north if we move in force against them, but if we abandon our position here, the Lannisters could link with the Tyrells unopposed. Our sisters remain captives. the entire cause could be lost. Jon cleared his throat. We might need to split our forces, Robb. Leave a strong enough army in the south to continue pressuring the Lannisters, but send another part north to protect Winterfell. If we do nothing, Balon Greyjoy will root himself in our coasts like a barnacle, and the north will be in flames. Yes, Robb said, nodding quickly. Roose Bolton garrisons Harrenhal, but many of his men remain with us. We can send Bolton or another High Lord to rally the north. I must remain in the south, but I cannot abandon Bran and Rickon. He was torn, that much was clear. I'll have to think on who leads the northern relief force. His gaze flicked to Jon. For a moment, Jon wondered if Robb might send him. That prospect hammered Jon's heart with conflicting emotions. He wanted to protect Winterfell, to see Bran and Rickon safe. Yet leaving Robb alone in the south felt wrong, as if he'd be abandoning him to face the Lannisters without his best supporters. That night, Robb paced in his tent. Rain pattered on the canvas. Candlelight carved hollows under his eyes, and he looked older than his years. Jon waited in silence, letting his brother wrestle with the dilemma. At last, Robb exhaled, turning. I want to go north. My heart screams for it. But I'm king in the north, and I started this war to avenge father and free our sisters. If I turn back now, what will it have been for? Yet how can I call myself a king if I can't defend my own seat? I should never have trusted Theon. Jon spoke gently. You had good reason. Father tried to guide Theon to see loyalty in Winterfell as part of his upbringing. We can't blame ourselves entirely. It's Balon who's always wanted the Iron Islands to be a free kingdom. He's probably used Theon to strike at the perfect time. We can still address this. We have loyal bannermen. The north might stand behind you, even if your main host remains in the south for now. Robb nodded, eyes flicking around as if searching for answers in the shadowed corners of the tent. I'll send Roose Bolton's son, Ramsay, to rally men at the Dreadfort, or I can call upon Lord Manderley at White Harbor to raise more levies. Someone must retake Winterfell. In the meantime, I'll keep pressing south. If the war ends swiftly, we can free Sansa and Arya, then bring our entire might home to crush the Ironborn. A disquiet settled in Jon's chest at the mention of Ramsay Bolton. He had never met Ramsay, but the Boltons were rumored to be harsh overlords, and Ramsay was said to be even worse than his father. Yet there was no time to debate the moral fiber of the man. Necessity demanded action. Robb took a moment, rubbing the back of his neck. What if I sent you, Jon? You know Winterfell. Bran and Rickon look up to you. The men would rally behind the name Stark if you led them. Jon's heart lurched. I would do anything to save them, Robb. But you need me here, and I can't command bannermen as a bastard. Not truly. You're as much a Stark as I am, Robb said fiercely. The men know it. They've seen you fight. They trust your sword. And you've been my most trusted counsel in these dark times. If I send Roose Bolton or someone else, can I be certain they'll protect Bran and Rickon the way you would? Jon swallowed, hardly able to believe what Robb was suggesting. You're the king in the north, Robb. If you command it, I'll go. I'll gather what men I can and try to save Winterfell. But I worry for you. Robb hesitated. I'll have the great Jon Karstark and many others here. I'll manage. We're close to forging alliances that might tip the war. If we secure the Tyrells' neutrality or alliance, I might be able to force the Lannisters to release our sisters without a pitched battle for King's Landing. Then I'll come north with what strength I have left. By then, hopefully you'll have driven off the Ironborn. Jon stared at the tent's entrance, thinking of the long roads that led back to the Neck, thinking of the battered keeps and villages, thinking of the 1,000 ways the Ironborn could harm Bran and Rickon if they captured them. The memory of those two younger boys, so full of innocence, roiled his gut. If that's your wish, I'll do it. I'll ride at first light. Robb exhaled. Relief and sadness mingled in his gaze. A part of me wishes I could go myself, but if I leave now, everything we've built here might collapse. I trust you, Jon. With my life, with our family's life. They clasped forearms, a bond sealed by blood and tears. Outside, the rain whispered across the camp. Inside, hearts pounded with purpose. The decision was made. Jon Snow would lead a contingent of northern soldiers back to Winterfell, to defend it from the Ironborn, to keep Bran and Rickon out of Balon Greyjoy's clutches. King Robb would remain in the south, forging alliances or forcing the Lannisters' hand, determined to rescue Sansa and Arya and to avenge Ned Stark's murder. At dawn, Jon rose. Fog clung to the ground, swirling around the boots of men packing up tents. Robb stood in the weak morning light, his armor half-fastened, bidding farewell to Jon. They were alone for a moment, gray wind pressing his muzzle into Jon's leg, whimpering softly as if sensing their imminent parting. Jon knelt, ruffling the direwolf's thick fur. "Watch over him," he whispered. Gray wind licked his hand, then padded back to Robb's side. A pang of sorrow shot through Jon. He had grown attached to the beast's silent companionship, but he knew Robb needed Gray Wind more. Robb handed Jon a small leather pouch. "Letters for Lords Bolton, Manderly, Serwyn, and others. Summon them under my name. Show them these seals. Raise as many men as you need. Winterfell must not fall." Jon tucked the pouch inside his cloak. "I'll see it done. I swear it." They clasped hands. For a moment, brother looked upon brother, each seeing how war had changed them. Robb, the king in the north, carried a mantle of responsibility that aged him beyond his years. Jon, the black brother turned northern commander, felt both a sense of dread and a surge of determination. Then they separated. Jon mounted his horse, reined in beside 200 picked cavalry and 300 foot. Others would follow in smaller groups, or rally from the keeps once he arrived. The group set off northward, leaving Robb's main host to continue its slow southern push. The days that followed tested the men's endurance. The drizzle returned, sometimes lashing them with wind, other times clinging in a gray mist that turned the world into a half-seen gloom. The roads were in poor shape, battered by wagon wheels from armies that had marched this way only weeks before. Many of the local farmsteads lay empty or burnt. Everywhere, the stench of war hung heavy. Occasionally, Jon's outriders encountered bandits or broken men scrounging for scraps. Most scattered at the sight of an organized force. A few tried to fight, desperate or mad, and paid the price in blood. Jon took no pleasure in the killing but refused to let them endanger his men. On the evening they reached the neck, they found Moat Caelin's towers still in northern hands. The small garrison there recognized Jon at once, grateful for any news of Robb's doings. The castle's commander, a grizzled soldier named Graydon Reed, was kin to the Crannogmen. He pulled Jon aside, voice low. "Word has spread that Ironborn ships are raiding up the Salt Spear, burning villages near the Fever River. If they hold the coastline, they might try to push inland. But if you can rally the bannermen from the interior, they can box the Ironborn in." Jon's mouth tightened. "We will. Have you heard anything of Theon Greyjoy at Winterfell? Or of my brothers?" Graydon shook his head. "Ravens to Winterfell have gone unanswered. That's troubling." His eyes flickered with worry. "King Robb's gone south to rescue his sisters, but now the north is under attack. Strange times." "Strange indeed," Jon said. "I'm heading north immediately. Moat Caelin must hold. If the Ironborn try to move south, you'll be our shield." Graydon nodded fiercely. "They won't pass. Not through the neck. We'll make them regret it if they try." Jon pressed on the next day. As they left the bogs of the neck behind, the land opened into the familiar fields and pine forests of the north. The air turned colder, sharper, and it carried a scent of evergreen that reminded Jon of simpler days, when he trained in Winterfell's courtyard. But those days seemed impossibly distant now. He was no boy practicing with wooden swords. He was a man leading soldiers into a homeland threatened by foreign raiders. They swung by House Serwyn, where a handful of knights and foot soldiers joined them under Robb's summons. Then they pressed on to House Flint's holdings, gathering more. Jon found himself speaking to each lord and lady, brandishing Robb's sealed letters, urging them to muster men for the relief of Winterfell. Some took heart at the sight of Jon, a Stark in all but name. They saddled up and marched at once. Others grumbled about leaving their own keeps vulnerable. But most recognized that if Winterfell fell, the entire north could unravel, especially with Robb far away in the south. At night, Jon slept little. Memories of the war for the dawn, the old legends of the others, haunted him when he drifted off. He dreamed of the wall cracking under ice, of Ned Stark's face turning to ash. He dreamt of Theon, smiling one day in the courtyard at Winterfell, then burning the castle's towers the next. At times he woke in a sweat, heart thudding. Yet in the daylight he pressed on, stoic as Ned once was. That stoicism was his only armor against the swirl of war and betrayal. Finally, they drew near Winterfell. Smoke rose in a faint gray plume above the distant treeline. The outriders returned with grim expressions. The gates appeared open, and the Ironborn were inside. Jon felt a jolt of panic. He spurred his horse forward, urging his men to quicken their pace. He had not expected to see the castle so soon, nor to find the enemy so plainly in control. They halted out of sight, behind a low ridge a mile from the walls. Jon dismounted with his captains, Stout, Serwyn, a few others, to survey the scene. From the ridge, they could glimpse the turrets of Winterfell and the deep moat below its walls. Smoke rose from a courtyard building that looked partially burned. Theon Greyjoy's banner, a golden kraken on black, fluttered from the battle. Immense. Jon's stomach twisted in rage and disbelief. He had grown up within those walls. Now an invader's flag mocked the proud direwolf of House Stark. One of the outriders reported seeing perhaps only a few dozen Ironborn guarding the ramparts. But there could be more inside, the man warned. We glimpsed a handful patrolling near the main gate, and some towers seemed deserted. Jon ground his teeth. Theon had apparently taken Winterfell with only a small band. Likely because of how empty the castle's defenses had been after Robb had marched south with the bulk of their forces. If Theon was truly inside, then Bran and Rickon must be either prisoners or in hiding, or worse. Jon forced that last thought aside. They had to remain alive. "Surround the walls," Jon ordered, voice tight. "We'll cut off any escape. No one leaves or enters without my leave. Then we'll demand their surrender." His captains nodded. The men spread out, forming a loose cordon. Archers found positions behind the ridge, while small infantry groups moved stealthily through the forests around Winterfell, blocking every route. In the fading light, Jon rode closer with a small entourage, carrying a white flag to parley. His heart hammered in his chest as they stopped within arrow range of the gate. An Ironborn guard appeared atop the battlements, a pock-faced man with greasy hair. He squinted down. "Who goes there?" Jon removed his helm, letting them see his face. "I am Jon Snow, sworn brother of the Night's Watch, and I come on behalf of Robb Stark, King in the North. I demand you open these gates and release the castle to its rightful masters." The guard snorted. "The rightful masters are the Greyjoys. Winterfell is ours now." A second figure pushed the guard aside. Jon's breath caught. There stood Theon Greyjoy, leaning on the parapet, his cloak fluttering. He looked haggard, circles under his eyes, but he wore a sardonic smile. "Jon Snow," he called. "I never thought I'd see you leading an army." "It's not my army," Jon returned icily. "It belongs to House Stark. You of all people should know you have no right to this castle." Theon shook his head. "My father claims the North as our kingdom. If Robb can call himself king, why not Balon Greyjoy? So we've taken what's rightfully ours. You can go back to your black brothers, Jon. Tell your Oathbreakers the Ironborn rule here now." Fury spiked through Jon, but he forced his voice to remain steady. "Where are Bran and Rickon?" "Safe," Theon said, though he didn't sound convincing. "Guests, you might say. If you care about them, you'll order your men to withdraw and sail back where you came from." He paused, eyes narrowing. "Ah, but that's right. There is no ocean near Winterfell, is there? So you might find that difficult." Jon's grip on the reins tightened. He wanted to hurl curses at Theon, to call him a traitor, but he checked himself. This was about Bran and Rickon. "We have your castle surrounded, Theon." "Surrender?" and I'll let you and your men take the black, or else face Robb's justice later." That drew a harsh bark of laughter from Theon. "I was raised a hostage among the Starks half my life. I won't become one again, not for the wall, not for any throne. And I doubt Balon would accept it either." Jon scanned the battlements. He saw perhaps 10 Ironborn up there. If that was all Theon had, then the rest might be stationed around the courtyard. The castle was large, but Jon had more than 1,000 men, with more on the way. Short of a miracle, Theon couldn't hold Winterfell against a proper siege. But a siege could risk starving Bran and Rickon, or giving Theon time to do something desperate. His voice hardened. "Don't force this, Theon. Yield the castle. No one else needs to die." Theon's smirk cracked a bit. "Go back to your lines, Snow. We'll see how well you fare in the cold. This is the North, after all. Winter comes. We Ironborn thrive on harsh seas." He turned away. Jon tried to shout once more, but Theon disappeared from view. The Ironborn guard spat over the battlement and stepped back. Left with no immediate recourse, Jon wheeled his horse and returned to camp, seething. The men around him looked troubled. One ventured, "If they keep the boys hostage, they can threaten to kill them if we attack." Jon grimaced. "They can threaten what they will. We can't leave Bran and Rickon in there. We'll try stealth before a direct assault." Under the cloak of night, Jon convened with his captains and loyal retainers in a cramped, hastily erected pavilion. The flicker of a few lanterns cast dancing shadows over the dirt floor. Jon pointed to a rough sketch of Winterfell's layout. He knew every tower, every passage, every hidden sally port. "We might send a small force through the old escape tunnel from the crypts. My father had it built or expanded years ago. We used to explore it as children. If Theon's not aware of it, we could slip inside the castle." A hush followed. Some older soldiers nodded, recalling vague rumors of subterranean passages beneath Winterfell. One older retainer of House Stark confirmed it. "Aye, the crypts run deeper than most suspect. They say the old kings had secret ways to come and go. If Theon doesn't have the sense to post guards there, we can slip in and open the gates from within." Serwyn tapped the map. "It'll be risky. If Theon's men discover the infiltration, they might kill your brothers in retaliation." Jon's stomach twisted. "We'll have to be swift and quiet. Our first goal inside the walls is to secure Bran and Rickon. Once they're safe, we can signal the rest to storm the gate or scale the walls." A low murmur of agreement passed among them. One by one, they volunteered for the infiltration team. Jon only chose the handful he trusted most, the quietest, most capable. They would go with minimal armor, swords muffled. The rest would wait outside, ready to charge the moment the gate was opened. The plan was set for the following night, giving them a day to rest and scout, to confirm the Ironborn sentry positions. Jon prayed to the old gods that Theon would not discover the crypt tunnel in the meantime. The day passed slowly, tension stretching like drawn wire. Jon stationed archers around the perimeter to prevent any Ironborn attempts to slip out or call for reinforcements. Winterfell's great towers stood in somber silhouette against a gray sky. Jon remembered how those towers once seemed welcoming home. Now they were a fortress held by a betrayer who had grown up under the same roof. Night descended, cold and moonless. Jon led a group of 20 men through a thick stand of trees north of the castle, looping around to approach the crypt entrance. He wore dark leathers rather than the black cloak that might catch torchlight. A sword at his hip, another dagger in his belt. Beside him, men carried rope, small crowbars, knives for silent kills. The forest floor was soft with damp pine needles, muffling their footsteps. No wind stirred. When they reached the low, half-hidden doorway that led beneath the foundations, Jon's heart pounded in his ears. A guard or two might be posted inside, but they saw no sign of any watch at the crypt's entrance. Theon probably didn't even realize such a route existed, or else his men were spread too thin to guard it. Jon gave a soft signal, and 2 men pried the old wooden grate aside. The faint smell of earth and centuries-old dust wafted out. One by one, they slipped into the darkness. The crypt tunnel was cramped, lit only by the faint glow of hooded lanterns carried by Jon's men. The walls were hewn stone. Water dripped in places, forming small puddles. As they moved deeper, they passed the carved statues of ancient Stark lords, each perched above a tomb, stone direwolf at their feet. Jon's skin prickled at the sight of those silent guardians. Here lay the bones of men like Brandon the shipwright, Torrin the king who knelt, and so many others. He felt as if they were all watching, judging. He led them through the winding passages, heart hammering. If Theon had posted men at the far end, the infiltration might turn into a slaughter. But he heard no voices, no clank of steel. At length, they reached the stair that rose toward the castle's lower levels. A door of heavy oak blocked the way. Jon gestured to his men. Two pressed close, listening. Hearing nothing, they carefully tested the latch. It gave, scraping slightly. Everyone froze, breath held. No outcry came. With utmost care, they opened the door, revealing a dim corridor above. Jon crept up, peering around. He recognized this corridor, near the library tower, seldom used. It was lit by a single sputtering torch in an iron bracket. The floor was dusty, no sign of recent footprints. Theon must have concentrated his men near the main hall and the gatehouse. Jon breathed a silent thanks to the old gods. He beckoned his men onward, and they moved in small groups through the gloom, hugging the walls. He had to find Bran and Rickon first. Likely they'd be held in the Great Keep or Maester Luwin's turret. If Theon was using them as hostages, he would want them close. Jon led a small handful forward, leaving the others to spread out and handle any guards. Step by careful step, they passed the empty corridors. Memories tugged at Jon. He recalled chasing Robb along the same route when they were boys, playing at nights. Now his sword was unsheathed in earnest. When they reached the entrance to the Great Keep, they saw a single iron-born guard leaning against the doorframe, half dozing, an axe slung across his back. Jon's pulse quickened. He gave a signal. One of his men, a lithe huntsman from House Serwyn, slipped around behind the guard. In one smooth motion, the huntsman clamped a hand over the guard's mouth and slit his throat with a dagger. The guard gave a muffled gurgle, then sagged to the floor. Jon steadied his nerves. The sight of blood in his own home turned his stomach, but there was no other way. They entered the keep. The corridors were familiar in layout, but the hush felt eerie, as if the castle itself was holding its breath. Jon peered into an antechamber once used for storing winter supplies. The door was ajar, revealing a collapsed table and scattered sacks. No sign of the boys. Another corridor led them to the main hall's side entrance. They heard voices from within. Jon pressed himself flat against the wall, his men behind him. Torchlight flickered through the crack in the door. "Fools to stay here," a man was saying. He had a harsh accent of the Iron Islands. "We should flee, regroup with Dagmar at the stony shore. If that army out there attacks, we're done for." A second voice spat back. "The prince said we hold Winterfell. So we hold Winterfell until he says otherwise." Prince, Jon thought bitterly. Theon calling himself Balon's prince. He peeked through the gap. Two Ironborn stood near a long table, half-eaten bread and a flagon of ale before them. Another was dozing on a bench. Across the hall, a ladder led up to the dais. No sign of Bran or Rickon. Jon withdrew. They couldn't storm through here without raising an alarm. He remembered a separate spiral stair that led to the upper floors. He signaled his men to follow him back out into the corridor. They found the spiral stair easily enough, creeping upwards, ears pricked for footsteps. On the second landing, they heard a voice beyond a door, muffled but recognizable. Jon's heart stuttered. He gestured for silence. Gently, he pressed his ear against the thick wood. Inside, Theon Greyjoy was speaking to another man. "Didn't want it this way," Theon muttered. "If they just bent the knee without a fight." The second man sounded older. "You have to be strong. Ironborn don't take counsel from your Stark upbringing. The North is your enemy now, Theon." Jon swallowed. He gestured for two of his men to flank the door. If Theon was in there, perhaps Bran and Rickon were also. but busting in might mean a hostage standoff. He weighed the options, tension coiling in his gut. Then the decision was made for him. A shout echoed from below. One of the infiltration squads must have been discovered. An iron-born cry of alarm reverberated through the halls. The time for stealth had ended. "Go!" Jon hissed. His men smashed the door open, surging into the room with weapons raised. Theon whirled, eyes wild. He wore a padded jerkin, no heavy armor, a short sword in hand. With him was a grizzled ironborn with a thick beard. They both started in shock as Jon and his men poured in. Outside, the sounds of yelling and clashing steel erupted, telling Jon that the rest of his men were launching the attack. "Jon Snow," Theon hissed, stepping back. "How did you?" Jon advanced, blade leveled. "Where are Bran and Rickon?" The old ironborn lunged, axe whistling for Jon's head. Jon sidestepped, parried the blow with a shower of sparks, then drove his shoulder into the man's chest. The man stumbled. One of Jon's men thrust a spear into the old raider's gut, dropping him with a gargled cry. Meanwhile, Theon slashed at Jon's side, forcing him to pivot away from the dying man. The ring of steel filled the small chamber. "You traitor!" Jon spat, hacking at Theon's guard. Theon met each blow, teeth bared in defiance. For all his faults, Theon had skill with a blade. Ned Stark's training served him well. They circled each other in the cramped space, swords flashing in the lamplight. Theon's eyes were wild with desperation. Jon pressed forward, forcing Theon back with rapid strikes. Sparks flew. Theon's foot slipped on spilled blood, and Jon seized the opening. He knocked Theon's sword aside, pressing the tip of his own blade to Theon's throat. Theon froze, panting. "Finish it," he rasped. Jon's chest heaved. Part of him wanted to run Theon through for all he had done, for bringing war to Winterfell, endangering Bran and Rickon, betraying Robb. Yet he stayed his hand. "Where are my brothers?" Theon's eyes flicked to a door at the far side of the room. "They're not here," he said, and Jon heard a tremor in his voice. "Bran and Rickon escaped. I couldn't catch them." One of Jon's men wrenched the door open. Inside was a cramped side chamber, empty but for a toppled chair and scattered bedding. Jon's gaze snapped back to Theon. "Escaped where? If you've harmed them." Theon swallowed, Adam's apple bobbing against the steel tip. "I tried to flush them out. They ran. The small folk helped them. We searched the crypts, the stables, couldn't find them. Then the Northern Army showed. I don't have them, Jon." Jon's stomach churned. If they weren't here, where were they? Could they have fled into the countryside? They were children, one crippled, one hardly more than a babe. "Are they alive?" "I don't know," Theon said hoarsely. "Last I heard, they were with Hodder and that wildling woman, Osha. Maybe some Reed boys too. No one would give them up. I swear on the drowned god, I didn't kill them." A flicker of relief warred with panic in Jon's chest. At least Theon hadn't murdered them, if he was telling the truth. But that meant Bran and Rickon were lost somewhere in the wilderness. The keep shook with more sounds of combat. Ironborn men were likely battling Jon's infiltration squads or facing the main force that would soon break down the gates. Jon grit his teeth. "Call off your men. Surrender now. Maybe I'll let you live to see a trial." Theon's eyes flickered with conflicting emotions. Fear, anger, shame. But before he could speak, a thunderous crash sounded below. Jon heard a roar of voices, presumably the northern soldiers storming the courtyard. The deed was done. There was no turning back. Theon gave a ragged sigh, letting his sword clatter to the floor. "Better to die than rot in a northern dungeon," he said quietly. Jon pressed him back. "Cuff him," he said to two soldiers. "We'll see if you're so eager to die when Robb returns for you." The men seized Theon, forcing him to his knees, binding his wrists. He struggled only half-heartedly. Jon took a breath, adrenaline coursing through him. The castle was nearly theirs. They made their way downstairs, Theon in tow, to the main hall. The last pockets of ironborn resistance had been overwhelmed. Bodies lay strewn across the rushes. The battered men of Jon's infiltration force and those who'd broken through the gate were collecting swords from the living raiders. The castle's interior smelled of blood, smoke, and pine from the torches. Yet it was theirs. Winterfell was free. A sudden hush fell over the hall as Jon Snow strode in, Theon Greyjoy bound and limping behind him. The northern soldiers stared at the once proud ward of Ned Stark. Some spat curses. Others brandished weapons, demanding retribution for the betrayal. Theon hung his head, eyes on the stones beneath his feet. Jon raised a hand, quelling the uproar. "We'll hold him until the king in the north decides his fate." That brought nods of assent, though some men still glared murder at Theon. With the Ironborn subdued, a frantic search began for Bran and Rickon. Jon led men through every corridor, tower, and passage. They found no trace of the boys. Maester Luwin emerged from hiding in the glass garden, badly injured but alive. Clinging to the old man's arm was little Rickon's direwolf, Shaggy Dog, wounded with a crossbow bolt in his flank, but still standing guard over the maester. Jon rushed to Luwin's side, relief pounding in his chest. "Maester, are you all right?" The elderly man swayed, pressing a bloody cloth to his side. "I'll live, I hope. The Ironborn tried to kill me, but Shaggy Dog intervened." He coughed. "Bran and Rickon. They fled some days ago with Hodder, Osha, and the Reed siblings. They feared Theon would use them as hostages. I told them to run, to hide." Jon clenched his fists. Where would they go? "I suspect to the far north, perhaps to seek refuge among the Crannogmen, or to hide in the Wolfswood." Luwin's voice trembled. "They have no safe harbor. With the war raging, every road is perilous." Jon drew a shaky breath. At least they were alive. "We'll find them. First, let's get you treated." The search continued for signs of the children's path. Tracks in the courtyard suggested they had left on foot, likely in secret. Jon assigned small scouting parties to comb the woods. He prayed to the old gods that Bran's disability would not prevent him from escaping roving wolves or worse in those dark pines. But he had no choice now except to hope or to try to track them. Maester Luwin needed medical care, and so did many others. Winterfell itself was half in ruins from Theon's occupation. Burned sections of the library, collapsed beams near the stables. The stench of smoke clung to everything. Dawn broke on a subdued scene. Winterfell's banners were raised again, the dire wolf snapping in the cold breeze, but the ruin was undeniable. Soldiers trudged about, burying bodies, clearing debris. The Ironborn survivors were penned in the old cells below the Great Keep. Theon languished there under heavy guard. Outside the walls, the encamped northern forces lit fires to warm themselves, uncertain of the next step. Jon, having slept barely an hour, emerged into the courtyard to speak with his gathered captains. A hush fell as he approached. "We hold Winterfell again," Jon began, his voice carrying a steely edge. "But Bran and Rickon are missing, likely fled for their lives. We must find them. I'm sending search parties to the Wolfswood, to the swamps near the neck, anywhere they might go. In the meantime, we must also guard against further Ironborn raids. Lord Bolton is rumored to be raising men at the Dreadfort. We'll coordinate with him to push the Ironborn from our coasts. Let no man say the North cannot protect its own." A murmur of assent spread. Some asked when the king in the north would return, but Jon had no satisfying answer. Robb was still in the south, grappling with Lannisters and Tyrells. The best Jon could do was secure the home front. "We hold until Robb comes," he said, "and if the Ironborn come again, we break them. No quarter." Within hours, parties of scouts set out, hunting for any sign of the young Starks. Jon commanded one group personally, leading them west into the Wolfswood, where thick conifers cloaked the land in green gloom. They followed faint trails, old game tracks, calling Bran's name occasionally, though mindful that they might attract brigands or wild animals. By nightfall, they had found nothing but deer scat and some older footprints, possibly belonging to small folk fleeing the war. One set of tracks might have been Hodder's large footprints, but it vanished near a stream, lost on stony ground. On the second day of searching, they chanced upon a battered wagon with a broken wheel, half sunk in muddy earth. The remains of a campfire indicated it had been used recently. Inside the wagon, Jon found scraps of cloth that he recognized as Winterfell servant garb. More hopeful was a small piece of rope with bits of direwolf fur snagged in the fibers, black fur, which might have been Shaggy Dog's. The group concluded that at least Rickon and his wolf had passed this way. They pressed on. That evening, as they made camp under towering pines, Jon's men gathered around a small fire. Dusk brought a chorus of owls and wind sighing through the branches. Jon leaned on a fallen log, fatigue tugging at him. Some of the men dozed, while others took watch. In the flickering light, Jon thought of what it meant to be king in the north, how Ned Stark had never sought such power, yet wielded it in the sense of duty. Robb was now the official king, but the burdens of rulership fell on all the Starks. Jon felt it keenly. The fate of these two lost boys weighed on him. If he failed to find them, could he ever face Robb again? In a half-doze, he remembered conversations with Eddard Stark. Once, years ago, Ned had found Jon practicing archery alone in the yard, tears brimming after a spat with Sansa about him being a bastard. Ned had laid a hand on Jon's shoulder and said, "There is more to family than names. You are my blood, Jon. That means you share in our house, our burdens. When the time comes, you'll do what's needed to protect your siblings." At the time, Jon had wondered if that would ever matter. Now it mattered more than anything. The next morning, as they prepared to ride again, a shout echoed from a scout deeper in the woods. Jon rushed to investigate. They found a small clearing strewn with older campfires and evidence that multiple travelers had sheltered there. Among the leaf litter, one of Jon's men picked up a scrap of cloth embroidered with the sigil of House Reed. A small lizard lion. It was half-burned, but recognizable. Jon's heart soared. The Reeds were loyal friends of the Starks, known to dwell in the swamps. If Bran and Rickon were traveling with them, it boded well. The Reeds were resourceful. Perhaps they were escorting the boys to Greywater Watch, the seat of House Reed, hidden in the bogs. Jon redirected the search east, guessing they might try to circle back toward the neck. The going was slow, slogging through damp terrain and thick undergrowth. The men grew weary, nerves frayed. A few times they encountered wolves or boars, startled from their dens. One soldier was gored by a boar's tusk and had to be carried back to Winterfell for healing. Another soldier took a tumble off a slippery log that served as a makeshift bridge and nearly drowned in the swift current of a creek. But they continued, fueled by duty. At last, after nearly a week of searching, one of the trackers spotted fresh footprints near a shallow stream. Large footprints, possibly Hodder's, and smaller ones. The group followed them to a cluster of dense willows. There, they found a ramshackle campsite, and Hodder himself, cowering behind a fallen tree. He looked up as Jon's men approached, fear bright in his simple eyes. "Hodder?" he whispered, as if expecting more Ironborn. Jon lowered his sword, relief flooding him. "Hodder, it's me, Jon Snow. Where are Bran and Rickon?" He glanced around, pulse racing. The campsite was empty, though signs of a recent fire and some bedrolls indicated others had been here. Hodder rose to his full towering height. "Hodder," he said again, plaintive. Then he pointed deeper into a thicket. Jon motioned for his men to stay alert. They pressed through the tangle of willow branches until they emerged into a small clearing. There, perched on a mossy log, sat Bran Stark, pale-faced and shivering but alive. Osha, the wildling woman, stood protectively nearby, a spear in hand. And there, burrowed in a bedroll, was Rickon, asleep with Shaggy Dog curled at his side. At the sight of Jon, Osha tensed, then recognized him and let out a ragged breath. "Jon Snow," she said, voice trembling. "Thank the gods, or your old gods, or any gods at all." "The boys." Bran looked up at Jon with wide, hopeful eyes. "Jon, is it really you?" Jon knelt, his heart pounding with relief. "It's me. I've come to bring you home. Theon Greyjoy's men are gone. Winterfell is ours again." Rickon stirred, eyes fluttering open. He was even smaller than Jon remembered. His face lit up with a mixture of joy and fear, and he clung to Shaggydog's fur. "They burned rooms in the castle," he said in a tiny voice. "We ran away." Jon gently rested a hand on Rickon's shoulder. "You're safe now, both of you. Robb sent me back. He's in the south, but we're going to keep you protected until he returns." Bran, tears shining, nodded as if struggling to hold back sobs of relief. I'm so sorry we left Winterfell, but Theon, You did right," Jon assured him. "You're alive. That's all that matters. Come, let's get you back. We have men, supplies, we'll see you warm and fed." Took little convincing. Osha and the Reeds had parted ways a few days earlier, she explained, because the Reeds sought to move deeper into the swamps, fearing Theon's men. They left Osha to protect Bran and Rickon with Hodder. They'd had meager provisions, living off the land, uncertain how to proceed. Osha eyed Jon warily at first. She had once been a captive in Winterfell, though treated kindly by the Starks, but she saw that Jon's presence meant rescue. They packed up quickly, Hodder carrying Bran on his back. Rickon held Shaggydog's scruff. The journey back to Winterfell was slow but far less tense than their flight had been. Jon kept the children at the center of his column, watchful for any sign of bandits. To his immense relief, they reached the castle gates without incident. The men posted on the walls cheered mightily upon seeing the young Starks returned. Inside, the courtyard stirred with renewed life. Lords and soldiers, battered by war, paused their tasks to bow or cheer as Bran and Rickon were escorted to the Great Hall. Maester Luwin, still recovering from his wounds, struggled upright to greet them, tears in his eyes. Despite the scorched walls, the shattered gates, and the lingering gloom, Winterfell felt a breath of hope. The rightful heirs to House Stark had come home. Jon himself felt an unaccustomed wave of warmth in his chest as he watched. They had salvaged something precious from the wreckage of war. For the next few days, the castle focused on healing and reconstruction. Jon put the men to work repairing the worst of the damage, clearing debris. Fire-scorched beams were replaced if possible. The cracks in the outer walls were patched. He called for local villagers to return, offering them respite from the chaos outside. The Ironborn in the dungeons glowered and spat curses, but they were powerless now. Theon alone was kept in a separate cell, awaiting Robb's judgment. Jon visited him once, standing outside the bars. Theon looked gaunt, regret etched on his face. Jon said nothing for a long while. "You got what you wanted," Theon muttered. "Winterfell is yours again." "You never had the right to claim it," Jon said quietly. Theon's jaw tightened. "Then kill me or let me go. I can't stand rotting in this cell." Jon turned away. "You'll face the king in the North's justice," he said, echoing the words Ned Stark might have used. Then he walked out, leaving Theon alone in the damp darkness. A swirl of conflicting emotions churned within Jon. Pity, anger, betrayal. But there was too much else to do for him to linger on Theon's fate. Bran and Rickon needed reassurance. The castle's people needed leadership. So Jon stepped into that role, though he was not a Stark by name. The lords who rallied to Winterfell asked him for instructions. He wrote letters to inform Robb of their success and of the boys' safety, sending ravens south. He also sent riders to search for any sign of roving Ironborn in the north. Word returned that Dagmar Cleftjaw held Torrens Square and some coastal villages, but that forces from the Dreadfort and White Harbor were harassing them. A retaking of the coastline was in progress. One cold evening in the Godswood, Jon found Bran sitting by the black pool, wrapped in a thick fur blanket. The carved face of the heart tree loomed above, weeping red sap into the still water. Rickon was asleep in the great keep, exhausted from the day's excitement, but Bran preferred the quiet. Jon approached, footsteps crunching on dead leaves. "Bran, it's late. You should be resting indoors." Bran turned his pale eyes on Jon. "I've been dreaming, Jon. Strange dreams in which I can see through summer's eyes, soaring over walls. I see the forest from above, the shadows of men. I can't explain it." Jon frowned slightly, He had heard of wargs and skin changers in old tales, but he had never delved deep into that lore. "Have you told Maester Luwin?" "Yes, but he says it might be nightmares or illusions." "I'm not so sure." Bran's voice trembled, a mixture of wonder and fear. "It's like the old gods are calling me." Jon knelt by him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "You've been through a lot. Maybe your dreams are telling you that you're stronger than you know. You survived Theon's takeover. You protected Rickon. You're a true Stark." Bran's gaze flitted to the heart tree's face. "And you're truly our brother, no matter what Mother said." He took a shaky breath. "Thank you for saving us." Jon's throat tightened. He squeezed Bran's shoulder gently. "I'm only glad I got here in time." Bran nodded, silent tears slipping down his cheeks. In the hush of the godswood, they let the old gods bear witness to their reunion. Jon found some measure of peace, knowing the boys were safe for now. But in the back of his mind, he worried about Robb, about Sansa and Arya, about the realm's future. The war was far from over. Days turned into weeks. The northern lords who had come to defend Winterfell pushed the Ironborn back along the coast, retaking Torrhen's Square with brutal efficiency. Lord Manderly's levies from White Harbor secured the eastern shores. Reports arrived that the Iron Islanders fled back to their longships rather than face a well-organized northern host. One by one, the stolen keeps returned to Stark control. Balon Greyjoy's dream of a northern kingdom by the sea was crumbling fast. Jon oversaw these developments from Winterfell, feeling an odd mixture of pride and apprehension. He was no king, but for the moment, he commanded the loyalty of many northern bannermen. Even they began to joke that Jon might be a prince in the north, half laughing at the irony. Jon would wave off such talk. He had no claim. The realm recognized Robb as king in the north, and that was enough. Then the letters from the south began to arrive, carrying news that made Jon's blood run cold. The war had intensified on all fronts. One letter from Riverrun described how Tywin Lannister had indeed joined forces with the Tyrells. Renly Baratheon was dead, killed under suspicious circumstances that no one could fully explain. Stannis Baratheon was marching on King's Landing by sea, but Tyrion Lannister, acting as Hand of the King, was rumored to have prepared fiendish defenses. Rumors spoke of wildfire stalked in the city's catacombs. The entire capital could burn. Robb, in the midst of this chaos, had continued to push westward, harrying Tywin's supply lines. He sought to lure Tywin away from King's Landing so that Stannis might crush Joffrey, or if that failed, so that Robb could ransom Sansa and Arya. But the Tyrell alliance threatened to overwhelm even Stannis' strong force. Some said the Tyrell cavalry was unstoppable in open field. Meanwhile, more letters told of new intrigue. Joffrey had betrothed himself to Margaery Tyrell, sealing the alliance. The city's gates had opened to the Tyrell host. Lannister gold and Tyrell grain would keep King's Landing well-fed, even under partial siege. The balance of power was shifting quickly. During these anxious days, Jon felt powerless. He had reclaimed Winterfell, saved Bran and Rickon, but he could not help Robb in the south. He could only watch from afar, exchanging ravens with the king in the north, urging him to be cautious. One letter from Robb read, "We have had successes near the crag and Ashmark. The Lannisters fear the wolf and flee our path. Yet we have not forced them into a conclusive battle. Tywin is wily. He knows I cannot linger forever, that winter encroaches. Stannis' fleet threatens King's Landing, but now the Tyrells stand with Joffrey. I must find another path to free our sisters. Mother negotiates, but Cersei demands too high a price. I fear time is not our ally." Another letter hinted that Robb might consider a daring march on King's Landing if Stannis weakened its defenses. Jon could almost taste the desperation in his brother's words. "If only we could unite with Stannis or coax the Tyrells to remain neutral," Robb wrote, "we might end this war swiftly." But the Lords of the Reach had chosen the Lannister alliance in exchange for a royal marriage. Now the North's foes were legion. Winter crept closer. Frost rimed the edges of Winterfell's broken walls each morning. The gods' pond froze in thin sheets that cracked at midday. Snow fell in light flurries, swirling across the courtyard. Bran and Rickon watched it from the windows, though Rickon sometimes scrambled outside to chase after swirling flakes with Shaggy Dog. It warmed Jon's heart to see them reclaiming some semblance of childhood, though the gloom of war still overshadowed them all. In these weeks, Lord Roose Bolton returned briefly to Winterfell. He brought his taciturn retinue, pale men with the flayed man's sigil upon their banners. Bolton was polite to Jon, praising him for retaking the castle, but his cold eyes offered little warmth. He asked many questions about Theon's captivity and about the future of the war. Jon gave him measured answers. Despite sharing the same cause, Jon did not trust Roose Bolton. Something in the man's quiet gaze spoke of cruelty held in check only by convenience. Bolton departed again to oversee the final eradication of Ironborn stragglers. A hush settled over Winterfell. Jon spent time with Bran, teaching him small bits of swordwork from a seated position, exercises more for coordination than real combat, though Bran insisted on trying. Rickon dashed about underfoot, occasionally tangling himself in swords or practice dummies. Even in this time of adversity, the ancient seat of House Stark felt alive again. Then came another raven from Robb, more urgent than the rest. It read, "Jon, I prepare to move against King's Landing in concert with Stannis Baratheon. Word is he lost many ships to wildfire in Blackwater Bay, but he still has an army outside the city. The Tyrells and Lannisters, however, joined forces and crushed Stannis' assault. The city stands. I am told Stannis retreated to Dragonstone, licking his wounds. Now Tywin rules the capital as Hand, and Margaery Tyrell is to marry Joffrey soon. We have parted ways with a meager victory. A few more Lannister outposts burned, but no major blow. Mother despairs of securing Sansa and Arya without a direct trade for Jaime. Karstark demands Jaime's head, but we cannot do that if we hope for an exchange. Time is running out. I may attempt a bold thrust toward King's Landing to pressure Tywin, but I fear the Tyrell armies outnumber us. If we fail, it means ruin. Pray for our success. If the worst comes, I beg you protect Bran and Rickon in Winterfell and hold the north. Father would want us to remain strong. I do not yet know when I'll return. Robb Stark, King in the North." Jon read the letter over and over, a knot of dread in his stomach. The Lannister-Tyrell union changed everything. Their combined might had shattered Stannis' main assault at the Battle of the Blackwater, and Robb's chance to coordinate with Stannis had evaporated. Without Stannis to divide the Lannisters' attention, Robb's host risked being overwhelmed. Jon felt helpless, stuck in Winterfell while his brother fought a potentially hopeless war. Still, the North had to be guarded. The Ironborn threat had largely subsided, but there were whispers of wildling raids beyond the wall. A new rumor said Mance Rayder was gathering an army in the Frostfangs. None of that was confirmed, yet it tugged at Jon's sense of duty to the Night's Watch. He lived in two worlds, bound to the Black Oath, but also to House Stark. If only the realm were united, perhaps they could face these threats together instead of bleeding each other dry in endless civil war. Winter advanced. Snow began to fall in earnest, blanketing the courtyard. Winterfell's roofs sagged under the weight. The stark winter sky seemed to loom overhead, pressing down. The nights grew longer, the wind keening around the walls with an eerie voice, as if the old ghosts of the castle were awakened by the chill. And still no sign of Robb's return. At last, deep in midwinter, a small party of riders appeared at the horizon, forging through the drifted snow toward Winterfell. The watchers on the walls rushed to report. They carried the direwolf banner. Jon's heart leapt. He ordered the gates opened, ignoring the swirl of flurries that stung his cheeks. Bran and Rickon waited beside him, huddled in cloaks, while the men cleared the courtyard to receive the king's arrival. The riders entered slowly, horses blowing steam in the icy air. At their head, looking thinner and older than Jon had ever seen him, was Robb Stark. His hair was longer, his face lined, a bandage wrapped around one arm beneath his cloak. Gray wind padded at his side, muzzle streaked with frost. A handful of northern bannermen followed, many wearing fresh scars or injuries. Their numbers were few, far fewer than the proud host that had marched south so many moons ago. Robb dismounted stiffly. Jon strode forward, heart pounding with relief, but also with dread at the sight of how diminished Robb's party looked. Gray Wind bounded ahead, whining in greeting. Bran wheeled himself forward in a makeshift chair that Jon's men had built, and Rickon trailed, wide-eyed. Robb's face softened as he took in the sight of his younger brothers alive and well. He bent, arms outstretched, and embraced them both as best he could. "Bran, Rickon," he murmured. "Thank the gods." Bran clung to him, tears slipping down his cheeks. Rickon pressed his face into Robb's side, trembling. "We're all right," Rickon said in a small voice. "Jon saved us." Robb exhaled, standing upright to face Jon. "I heard. Thank you, brought her." He clasped Jon's arm, eyes shining with gratitude. For a moment, the burdens of war fell away, replaced by the simple joy of a family reunited. But the moment passed, and in its wake, an unspoken sorrow clung to them like a shroud. They moved inside to the great hall, stoking the hearth fires high to banish the chill. Servants scrambled to bring food and hot mulled wine. Robb's men found places along the benches, exhausted. Jon could see the haunted looks in their eyes. He guided Robb to the high table, where Maester Luwin waited with bandages and salves. Robb accepted the maester's attentions, wincing as the old man unwrapped the half-frozen bandage, revealing a sword cut that had only partially healed. "A gift from a Lannister outrider," Robb muttered grimly. Once Robb was seen to, once Bran and Rickon were assured their brother was alive, once some measure of warmth had returned to their bones, the grim news spilled forth. Robb confirmed that the war in the south had gone poorly after Stannis's defeat at the Blackwater. Tywin Lannister, with the Tyrells at his back, had forced the North's host into a series of cautious retreats. Though Robb had won battles on open ground, he could not advance without risking total encirclement. Jaime Lannister remained a prisoner, but that had not secured Sansa and Arya's freedom. Cersei refused any trade that did not return Jaime safely first. Robb had refused to hand him over without guarantees. A stalemate had ensued, draining resources. Then, with winter coming, the northern lords urged Robb to pull back. So he did. "We marched north through storms, losing men to cold and hunger," Robb said, swirling a cup of wine in his trembling hand. "Many of our wounded died on the road. We had to leave some behind at the twins in Walder Frey's care. I distrust him, but we had no choice. Others scattered to hold their own lands. Now we're a fraction of what we were. The Lannisters name me a rebel in retreat, claim I've given up the fight." Jon frowned. "Have you?" Robb's eyes flashed. "Never. As long as they hold Sansa and Arya, as long as Joffrey keeps father's head on a spike, the war is not over. But I must face reality. The North cannot fight the combined might of the Lannisters and Tyrells alone. Winter is upon us. My people are starving, my men freezing. We have reclaimed our seat, but at what cost?" A heavy silence followed. Bran stared into the flames. Rickon dozed in his chair, lulled by the warmth. Maester Luwin busied himself with the wounded men. Jon spoke quietly. "Then what do we do now?" Robb shut his eyes, looking every inch the weary king. "We hold the North. Secure it from any new threat. Let the Lannisters keep their Iron Throne if it must be so. Perhaps they'll bargain once they see the futility of pressing a winter campaign into the North. We can't storm King's Landing while we starve in the snow." "And Sansa and Arya?" Jon asked softly, though he feared the answer. Robb's hand shook around his wine cup. "I do not know. I may try one last negotiation. The Lannisters might be overconfident now, so perhaps they'd accept a trade for Jaime. If I can secure safe passage for my sisters, I might be forced to let Jaime go. Even then, who knows if Joffrey will honor the terms." They fell into a brooding silence, each man weighed by the enormity of the choice. Exchange Jaime Lannister, responsible for so much bloodshed, for a chance to free two Stark girls. Would the Lannisters simply renege once Jaime was safe? Possibly. But in the face of winter, with the North battered, what other option remained? In the following days, Winterfell's halls rang once more with the bustle of an assembled host, though smaller than before. Fires blazed to ward off the cold. Robb took stock of their supplies, conferring with local lords. They had enough to survive the winter if carefully rationed. Messengers were sent across the north, declaring that King Robb had returned to defend his homeland. Many lords rejoiced. Others noted that the war had effectively stalemated. Still, the knowledge that the Starks again ruled from Winterfell brought a semblance of hope. Letters were dispatched to King's Landing, requesting negotiations for a hostage exchange. Weeks passed without reply. Meanwhile, the snows deepened. Rickon ran through drifts in the courtyard, chasing Shaggy Dog with unbridled glee. Bran retreated into the warmth of the library, reading old histories with Maester Luwin. Robb paced the castle like a caged wolf, restless and uneasy. Jon assisted where he could, managing patrols, ensuring the walls were manned. Ghost, who had finally arrived from Castle Black, led by a pair of brothers sent with messages, stalked the ramparts, a silent white shadow. One gray morning, a raven arrived bearing the seal of the Lion and Rose, House Lannister and House Tyrell, combined. Robb opened it in the Great Hall with Jon and Bran present, as well as a few northern lords. The letter was from Tywin Lannister, newly named Hand of the King. It stated that King Joffrey might entertain a prisoner exchange for Sansa, only Sansa, not Arya, so long as Jaime Lannister was released unharmed and escorted south under flag of truce. No mention was made of Arya's whereabouts or condition. The letter further demanded that Robb Stark swear an oath of fealty, acknowledging Joffrey as the rightful king. The threat was unspoken. If Robb refused, Sansa's well-being could not be guaranteed. A hush fell. Bran looked up at Robb, eyes full of worry. Jon gritted his teeth. To yield now, to name Joffrey as king, would be anathema to everything they had fought for. Yet to refuse might doom Sansa. Arya's fate was unknown, which only made the cruelty of the offer more potent. Robb crumpled the parchment in his fist, face ashen with fury. They would make me bend the knee or let Sansa suffer. The devils. Jon stepped closer. We don't even know if they truly have Arya. Last we heard, she escaped the city. This might be a trick to lure you into capitulation, or to sow doubt in the north. Bran's voice was small. What about Sansa? She's in the Red Keep, they say. She's only a girl. She can't bear that cruelty. A pall of grief settled over Robb's face. We have to try. We can arrange the exchange of Jaime for Sansa, at least. As for the oath of fealty. His hands tightened around the letter until the parchment tore. I will not kneel. But if that means Sansa suffers, how can I live with myself? The lords muttered, uncertain. One ventured that they might attempt a ruse. Hand over Jaime under conditions that guaranteed Sansa's release first. But Tywin Lannister was no fool. Another lord suggested they kill Jaime and be done with it. Karstark, in particular, wanted Jaime's blood. But that would doom Sansa for sure. The moral agony weighed on all of them. In the end, Robb composed a careful reply. He offered an exchange, Sansa for Jaime, at a neutral site. He proposed meeting near Harrenhal once winter's worst had passed. He refused to declare fealty, but stated that further bloodshed could be avoided if the crown recognized the North's independence. It was a forlorn hope, yet no other path lay open. As the winds howled outside the walls, snow piling high, Winterfell stood as an island of flickering light in a sea of freezing white. Each day, men struggled to keep the walls clear, the gates from icing over. Supplies were rationed carefully, though no one yet starved. Robb waited for a raven in return, or for a chance to move south again. Months might pass before the snows thawed enough for an army to march. For now, the war froze in place, but hearts remained restless. Jon took over day-to-day governance in some respects, for Robb's spirit had grown heavy. The king paced the halls, haunted by thoughts of Sansa and Arya. At times, he took long rides beyond the castle, braving the snow and cold, gray wind at his side, as if searching for clarity in the biting wind. Lords grew concerned that their king might lose hope altogether. During one such ride, Robb did not return by nightfall. A worried hush spread among the castle folk. Jon organized a search party at dawn. They found him in the Wolfswood, near a half-frozen stream, his horse wandering aimlessly. Robb sat under a bent pine, gray wind curled at his feet. He stared at the rushing water, as if lost in some half-dream. When Jon dismounted and approached, Robb looked up, tears streaking his face. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I failed father. I can't save Sansa or Arya. I can't keep the North safe without losing them. Our people starve or they freeze, and I have no answer." He pressed a hand to his chest, voice trembling with despair. "Maybe I was never meant to be king." Jon knelt beside him, gently placing a hand on Robb's shoulder. "You didn't fail, father. The realm failed him, men like Joffrey and Tywin. You're the best hope the North has. You've saved thousands of lives by standing up to the Lannisters. You've kept Bran and Rickon safe. You can still save Sansa, and if Arya lives, we'll find her. The war's not done." Robb sniffed, blinking away tears. Gray wind nuzzled his arm. "It feels done. We can't march in this winter. Tywin has the wealth, the food, the Tyrell alliance. By spring, they'll be unstoppable." Jon gazed at the swirling water, swirling as his thoughts were. "Wars have turned on smaller chances, brother. If you lose heart, the North will lose heart. You have to keep faith for Sansa, for Arya, for all of us." He paused. "Father once told me that when you can't do anything else, you keep your honor. That's all a Stark can do. And you have your honor, Robb. Don't throw it away." A heavy silence hung. Then Robb slowly rose, brushing snow from his cloak. He looked at Jon with gratitude and sorrow. "You should have been the trueborn son, not me. You hold father's spirit more closely than I ever could." Jon shook his head. "I'm no heir, Robb. I'm just your brother. And I'll always be here to help you stand." They returned to Winterfell, where the weeks of winter dragged on. The snows deepened to the point that movement was nearly impossible. The men huddled around hearths, telling stories, awaiting the next raven. Meanwhile, Theon Greyjoy languished in the dungeon, his fate uncertain. Roose Bolton occasionally sent terse messages about hunting stray Ironborn, otherwise staying in his own domain. Walder Frey's dispositions remained murky. Edmure Tully held Riverrun, also pinned by winter, unable to send aid. The realm seemed locked in a frozen stalemate. In that bleak hush, ravens finally arrived with word from King's Landing. Tywin Lannister refused to recognize the North's independence. He also refused to release Arya, claiming ignorance of her whereabouts. He agreed only to an exchange of Jaime for Sansa at Harrenhal once the roads were passable, and he demanded that Robb personally attend, offering a vow that Jaime would be returned in good faith. The letter ended with a veiled threat that any duplicity on Robb's part would result in Sansa's head on a spike. Robb read the letter by the flickering light of the Great Hall's fire, while Jon, Bran, Rickon, and a few lords looked on. He said nothing for a long while. Then he nodded, face set. "So be it. We'll do it their way. Once the snows melt enough to travel, I'll ride to Harrenhal. Jaime will come from the south, hopefully with Sansa. We'll see if the Lannisters keep their word." "It could be a trap," Jon warned. Robb's eyes gleamed with grim acceptance. "Of course it might be, but I have no choice." He looked to Bran, to Rickon. "She's our sister." Bran nodded slowly, sorrow etched in his pale features. Rickon looked fearful, not fully grasping the politics but understanding the danger to Sansa. Jon felt an ache in his chest. This was the best chance to save at least one sister, but it came at a terrible price. And if the Lannisters lied, or if they decided to punish Sansa for Ned's so-called treason at the last moment, it would tear the heart from them all. The winter nights passed in slow succession. At last, spring began to hint at the edges of the north, though the days were still cold. Slowly, the roads cleared enough for an armed party to move south. Robb prepared to leave, taking Jaime Lannister, still a captive, and a select group of his best men. The Great Jon insisted on coming, as did Rickard Karstark, though the latter burned with hatred for Jaime. Jon offered to come as well, but Robb shook his head. "No, you stay here," he said, though it pained him. "Winterfell needs you. If this goes wrong, you'll have to protect Bran and Rickon. The North can't lose all its heirs at once." Jon bristled. "You'd go alone to Harrenhal with only a small force?" Robb forced a wry smile. "I'll bring enough men to hold our own if it's merely a token escort from the Lannisters. Besides, Jaime is our best bargaining piece. I must be the one to do this. If Tywin tries to betray us, well, I have faith in my men." But Jon could see the flicker of uncertainty behind his brother's eyes. The memory of Tywin's cunning, the Tyrell Knights, and the fear for Sansa weighed heavily. The day of departure dawned. Snow still drifted in shady corners of the courtyard, but the sun overhead offered a pale warmth. A line of riders prepared, their horses snorting in the cool air. Jaime Lannister, bound and carefully guarded, smirked with a facade of confidence, though his face looked thinner, his hair longer and tangled. He wore a simple tunic, no shining armor for the Kingslayer. Many northern soldiers glowered at him, Karstark especially, but Robb had forbidden any revenge. Sansa's life depended on Jaime remaining alive. Robb embraced Bran and Rickon by the gate. Bran clung to him fiercely. "Come back safe," he murmured. "I'll do my best," Robb said, forcing a smile. He turned to Jon last. They stood face to face, silent for a moment, thousands of unspoken words in the space between them. "Watch over them," Robb said quietly. If something happens, you'll be the Stark in Winterfell. You must keep them safe." Jon's throat felt tight. He nodded. "I will, but you'll return with Sansa. I know it." A ghost of a smile touched Robb's lips. "Farewell, brother." They clasped arms in a fierce grip. Then Robb swung into his saddle. Grey Wind padded alongside him, tall and proud. With a final wave, the king in the north led his retinue through the gates, Jaime Lannister in their midst. Jon, Bran, Rickon, and the gathered folk of Winterfell watched them vanish down the road. An uneasy hush fell over the courtyard. The future teetered on a knife's edge. If Robb succeeded, Sansa might be free, the war might find a path to resolution, or at least a respite. But if the Lannisters betrayed them, or if House Tyrell decided to break the truce, the North could lose its king and remain forever bound in a hopeless war. Yet Jon forced himself to stand tall, radiating confidence for those who looked to him in Robb's absence. He remembered how Ned Stark once stood in this same courtyard, sending men off to war, bearing the weight of the North's fate. Jon never thought he'd be in that position, but here he was. He inhaled the cold air, letting it burn in his chest. He would not let his father's memory down. He would not let Robb or any Stark down. The gates closed, and the days ticked by once more. Each dawn, Jon rose early, oversaw the castle's needs, managed patrols, calmed worried lords. Each dusk, he gazed southward, praying to see a raven in the sky bearing news of Robb's success. Bran sat with him often, silent, as the horizon blazed orange at sunset. Rickon would sometimes drift by, asking, "When will Robb return?" And Jon would answer gently, "Soon." Though he had no certainty, spring advanced in fits and starts. The ground began to thaw. The roads grew muddy, then dried under timid sunshine. The first buds of new grass poked through the snowmelt in the fields around Winterfell. The days lengthened. Still no raven came from Robb. The tension among the castle folk grew. They whispered of betrayal, of ambush, of a second red wedding that might befall their king. Jon tried to quell these rumors, but they festered in the silent corners of the castle. Finally, late one afternoon, a single raven arrived on tired wings. Jon hurried to Maester Luwin's tower, heart pounding. The maester cracked the seal, read swiftly. His eyes widened. He handed it to Jon, breath shaky. Jon scanned the parchment. It was from a northern scout near the Twins, reporting that King Robb had passed by heading south, but had not returned by the expected date. The scout had gleaned rumors from travelers that Lannister forces were massing at Harrenhal. Possibly the exchange had taken place, or perhaps it was yet to occur. No firm news, but the scout had heard one chilling piece of gossip. that a large force of Frey men had marched from the twins toward Harrenhal under Walder Frey's command, possibly to lend assistance to the crown. Jon's blood ran cold. He recalled Walder Frey's sly nature, his readiness to betray if it suited him. And now the Freys might be moving south to entrap Robb at Harrenhal. Alarm bells rang in Jon's mind. This could be the worst possible scenario. An alliance of Lannister, Tyrell, and Frey forces surrounding Robb's smaller host. Sansa's life was uncertain. Jaime's life was in their hands. It was a perfect setup for disaster. Jon slammed a fist on the table, frustration and dread coursing through him. "We must ride south to help him," he nearly shouted. But he knew the roads might still be treacherous, and the north was only just recovering. If they marched now, they might arrive too late, or might leave Winterfell exposed. Yet sitting idle could condemn Robb. He looked at Maester Luwin, anguish in his eyes. What would Ned Stark do? Luwin's voice was soft, pained. He would try to save his son, no matter the risk. Jon nodded, a storm of conflicting obligations raging inside him. The watchers on the walls would see him pacing for hours that evening, conferring with the lords, wrestling with the choice. In the end, the memory of Ned's execution, how Ned had stood alone in King's Landing, with no rescue arriving, tipped Jon's hand. He would not let Robb stand alone at Harrenhal. If it was indeed a trap, the North must do what it could to break it. The next dawn saw a flurry of preparations, as Jon readied a war party to ride south. He would not bring the entire garrison. Winterfell needed enough men to protect Bran and Rickon, but he gathered a few hundred of the finest cavalry and foot, men loyal beyond question. He wrote letters to all northern lords, urging them to send what forces they could spare south immediately, in case of a Frey Lannister treachery. Then he buckled on his armor, strapped Longclaw to his hip, and gathered his standard-bearer, who would carry the direwolf banner in Robb's name. Bran came to see him off in the courtyard, tears in his eyes. "Jon, please be careful. I can't lose both of my brothers." Jon knelt by him. "I'll be careful. Hodder and Osha and the men remain to guard you. You and Rickon stay safe. If I don't come back, you'll..." His voice caught. "You'll be the Stark of Winterfell." Bran bit his lip, tears threatening. "You're a Stark too, Jon." Jon swallowed. "In every way that matters. But for now, I must do this. Pray for Robb. Pray for us all." He embraced Bran, ruffled Rickon's hair. Ghost, standing at Jon's side, let out a soft, mournful whine. Then Jon climbed into the saddle, the black cloak swirling around him. The gates opened. With a thunder of hooves and a wave of the direwolf banner, Jon Snow and his war party set forth, forging south through the muddy roads, determined to save Robb from whatever fate lurked at Harrenhal. The castle folk watched them go, a knot of fear in every heart. Winter's gloom still lingered, but the pale spring sun offered a hint of warmth. Whether that warmth would shine on a rescued Sansa, a triumphant king in the north, and a realm somehow inching toward peace, or whether it would fade into the darkness of another tragedy, remained to be seen. But Jon Snow rode onward, unwavering, the memory of Ned Stark's honor lighting his path, ready to face the next trial with steel in hand and the wolf's courage in his veins.